We start our story in a cozy little flower shop in the middle of the city. The storefront was filled with countless beautiful arrangements up for sale. With the peaceful and serene sight of different types of flowers, the voice of a complaining young man coming from the inside did not seem to fit the scenery at all. He buried his face and blue hair in one of his books, seemingly ready to give up on his academic aspirations altogether. You can't blame him, though. Being surrounded by a mountain of textbooks would make anyone's head spin, especially if you don't particularly enjoy studying. The young man's mom watched him like a hawk. She knew this rascal had already started slacking off after only 5 minutes of barely picking up a book after stuffing his face with food. He wasn't making his mom's life easy at all. She even compared him to someone named Xiao Ling from Auntie Wang's house, who goes to extra classes for 2 hours at noon. He's a bum compared to that kid. Mom wanted to make a compromise. If this young man couldn't stand perusing the pages, then he could help hang the flower baskets on the shop racks for now. But he must remember to tie the ropes securely, as it has gotten extra windy in the city lately. Whatever this task was, it was surely better than burying his head in textbooks. The hanging plants were supposed to be low-maintenance plants that just need water and sunlight, yet his mom always insisted on changing their position occasionally. Staring at the pot, the boy could not help but wish to just be a plant. All plants do is bask in the sun, drink water, grow a lot, just leading a lazy and comfortable life overall. Even though he's the one using a pretty high ladder, his mom seemed way more concerned about her plants falling than her own son. He was apparently doing it wrong, and she would rather do it herself on second thought. What followed was the ungodly killing ability of every mother ever, the endless barrage of making their child feel like crap for slacking off and lacking motivation. She insisted that even if this kid turned into a plant, he would still probably be a bum. The business of the city was quite a nice change of pace from the chaos of the flower shop brought upon by the terror mom. Being scolded by his mom again and again always gave the young man such severe headaches. He's currently walking through the streets, yawning lazily while half-heartedly reading another book. He really cannot comprehend where his mom gets all these words from when she gets on a roll. She talks like a machine gun that cannot be stopped at all. Or since she runs a plant shop, maybe a pea shooter was a more apt description. While he was busy imagining his mom as a plant versus zombies character, something drastic brought upon by the changing winds of the city was about to happen. A potted plant that looked to be one of those odd Venus flytrap things was knocked down by the wind and was now heading for his head with all its gravitational fury. He was way too bored, lazy, and tired to notice anything happening around him at all, especially some event that was happening way too fast to process. Truck-kun was on a vacation, so Secret Agent Pot Nissan did the job, and he ended up doing a pretty good job of it. 1 second, protagonist was just living the normal life of a normal below-average student. The next, the blood from his skull stained the concrete floor of the streets mixed in with the dirt, plant, and the broken pot. The onlookers did not expect to see something this brutal on their stroll on the way to work or school, or wherever they were going. A student just got hit by a flower pot, and the blood all over the sidewalk was a gruesome sight. Inside the young man's teetering mind, he hazily imagined a beautiful full-course meal of the perfect dinner from meat, veggies, to dessert. He remembered that he shared this amazing dinner with his mom and dad. He even praised her for her always tasty cooking. The young man eagerly took a bite of the rice, as you should always do in meal setups like this. But this white rice tasted a little odd. When he zoomed out of his imagination, his mom and dad were nowhere to be seen, and what replaced the scrumptious full-course meal was plates upon plates of disgusting dirt. Now he has become conscious that his mind might just be playing tricks on his perception. When he woke up, he was in an unfamiliar place that he couldn't quite explain or grasp. It was dark, and the smell was strangely pleasant. The odd thing was that he felt like his arms and legs were tied up. Upon inspecting the empty space even more, he noticed something green on the side and a light right above. Maybe he'll try to climb up and see that light a little better. It worked. Moving his body towards the little bit of illumination felt like he had been unleashed and rebirthed into the world. It felt like he broke through the earth to feel the elements. It felt that way because that's exactly what had just happened. A small budding plant had broken through the soil to bask in the intimate glow of the sunlight up above. He wanted to wipe the metaphorical sweat off his brows, but he did not feel any eyebrows. Still, finally crawling out of that darkness felt quite nice. Now that he was starting to think about it, something about this setup was extremely odd. Looking to the side, he knows that he wanted to move an arm to touch his face and forehead, but what his vision was giving him was a piece of leaf attached to a lanky stem. Now that he was looking at his whole body, it's fair to say that he looked and felt a lot different from his previous appearance. Not only that, but he was also in the middle of magical foliage in the middle of nowhere surrounded by mountain ranges. He was not expecting all of these at all. He was frozen solid, not knowing what in the world to do. The nourishing sunlight beamed down upon him along with other budding plants just like him all around the area. One thing's for sure is that he had somehow transformed into some sort of a little plant. The idea was so ridiculous that his mind is still refusing to believe that any of this was real. Perhaps he was just tripping. Trying to recall what led to this situation, he remembers eating lunch and going to school, then getting hit by a flower pot falling from an ungodly height. It felt ironic as he was just complaining about tending to his mom's hanging flower pots. He can only hope that he did not die such a shameful death in the middle of the midday crowd. It would just be too embarrassing at that point. But now he's starting to slowly come to believe that he really reincarnated into the form of a little fledgling plant. He remembered just a few hours ago, complaining about his studies and wishing just to become a lazy plant that lives a comfortable life. So this might just be it, the answer to his prayers and a possible nightmare scenario at the same time. The god or whoever was in charge of this world was way too sincere and literal. Just because he casually said some nonsense to procrastinate, the deity took it seriously. Now he can only cry and beg to get back to his previous life and form. As he was getting the dramatics out of the way, he remembered something crucial that might just be a game changer in this scenario. In web novels and manhwas, the main character who undergoes rebirth usually gets their own system and follows the path of becoming a god with overpowered abilities. But if that was the case here, then where's his OP system? Why didn't he receive at least a notification sound? He screamed and screamed for the system to appear to no avail. All the other plants from the same batch as him looked at him like a weirdo. A week later, he just quietly accepted the possibility that there might not be a system after pouring his heart and soul into calling for it non-stop. He might just be an ordinary plant, damned to live an ordinary life. The good news was that he's not just a piece of grass. The bad news is he used to be a strapping young man reborn as a weird-looking flower. Thankfully, he spawned in a nice piece of black soil, rich in nutrients, pleasant fragrances, and an oddly good taste. He feels like he can grow well in this environment. What sucks is that it's just a bit crowded in here, just like the gifted class he was in the previous world where everyone is trying to get ahead. Today was the day that some unpleasant development happened. The sunlight has vanished. It was not cloudy or anything. The skies were as clear as they could be. The problem was that the flowers growing alongside him had left him in the dirt. They've grown to the point of smothering the land and covering the skies. It's just unfair when all of them are plants that should just be chilling. For some reason, this just kept reminding him of the familiar scene back in his school where everyone was just so eager to impress. This time, he won't let these show-offs take his sunlight. He will push his way through and not let these flowers interrupt his sunbathing time. When he finally muscled through with great effort, he opened his eyes to the bright world that he had grown to love in the past week. His mood was immediately lifted now that he could finally see and feel the sunlight on his skin, or petals and leaves, and everything in his plant parts. Today was a day of unusual occurrence. Now that he had peered over everyone to bask in the sun, he saw some type of animal getting closer and closer to the flower bed. This dum-dum saw a majestic alpaca coming through and started calling it a wild horse. In his past life, Mom and Dad were always so busy with work that they never took him to the zoo even once. Well, this would be his first time seeing a mythical creature. It did not disappoint. The so-called wild horse is pretty cute in its own right. But he stopped in his tracks now that he remembered one simple fact. These things eat grass. There might be a world where the four-legged beast was coming closer and closer to take a bite out of him. Once the alpaca opened its mouth and its spittle flew all over the place, his nightmare scenario might just be happening right about now. He tried to cover himself desperately, not wanting to die yet. When the beast's tongue started coiling around the stems firmly rooted in the area, it had miraculously missed him. The majestic alpaca just stared at him with seemingly knowing eyes as it casually gnawed on the flowers. When it started turning around, he was left as the lonesome flower in the once thriving flower bed. Thankfully, this four-legged beast only took one bite, and it seems like he was not the alpaca's type of lunch. But before completely turning and walking away, the animal wanted to give one last gift to our poor protagonist, a steaming pile of rock-hard and gray doo-doo. He was speechless. He internally asked himself what in the world is happening. He stared at the pile of rich stool, then turned his attention to the enriching soil in which his roots were tethered. Bullets of sweat started dotting his face as he slowly came to realize the implication of this animal's normal but still disgusting behavior. When he finally came to terms with it, he felt the world literally go dull and gray, just like the color of the pile of crap where the nutrients of the rich black soil were coming from. Even though he had become a plant, processing the fact that he had grown as a flower in horse crap was still a bit too much to handle. He couldn't believe he even thought that this very black soil tasted delicious, tender, and palatable. One couldn't stop oneself from throwing up in this situation. Meanwhile, the remaining flowers that survived a few inches from him had been blooming in bliss and happiness under the sun. Of course, Bro had blossomed too. But there's a new development in his anatomy. There are tooth-like things in the center of his pistille, and all the flowers around him occasionally shoot him a ghostly expression because of it. They didn't even bother to hide the look of their collective disgust for our plant boy. Then, out of nowhere, a massive mirror just spawned right in front of him. It was a scene right out of those novels and manhwas that he reads. What he saw in the reflection was quite odd and disheartening. This is how he looks now. He has become a blooming big-mouthed flower. For some reason, he remembered his previous life when the only semblance of fun he could have had was the occasional playing of video games with friends. Still, back in those days, he was never good at games. He distinctly remembers dying to a Venus flytrap repeatedly. It seems like there are unfortunate things everywhere and anywhere. No wonder everyone was giving him weird looks in this isolated flower bed. Not only was he dreadfully short compared to everyone, but he also looked fundamentally different from the rest too. He was so busy feeling insecure and odd about his current physical form that he only realized the weirder thing that had just happened. A mirror just appeared in front of him unprompted. That must mean something, right? He tried poking the thing with precaution. In response to his gentle poke, the mirror seemingly disintegrated away from reality in just a few moments. Next came a magical prompt indicating that the detected host had blossomed and entered the juvenile stage. The flower system had been activated automatically. Now this was the good news that he was desperately hoping and waiting for. This was the day that his system had finally arrived. To help ease and guide him through the process, the cursedly ugly system companion Ruhwa had been deployed to help the dear user. Our plant bro's name is Wu Sun, currently a juvenile stage big mouth flower of 0.3 meters in height and ranked as an ordinary plant. He has no special genes, no defensive skills, no special skills, and with a single attacking skill called swallowing. Reading all his listed out attributes gave him a big fright. Even the flavor text of being a flower planted in alpaca dung felt like an insult. Also, this Ruhwa thing was just disturbing. Wu Sun felt like the system might have gotten it all wrong. He was supposed to dominate the world, right? While he was yapping and complaining about the unfairness of this newfound system, notifications about him as the host gaining 1.1 evolution points for 1 minute of sunbathing and 1 point for absorbing soil minerals continuously flooded down. Now these notifications he can definitely work with. The system might not be as bad as he initially thought. Continuously and passively gaining evolution points is a huge boon. There's only one line of thought regarding these points. They should be the currency used to upgrade and enhance himself, and they're adding up fast too. Wu Sun gloated and laughed as he had already gathered 100 evolution points without doing anything. The ultimate laid-back king with a built-in cheat system lifestyle might just be on the horizon. These other puny plants had better give up trying to compete with him for that delicious sunlight. As he was basking in the glow of imminent success, Ruhwa appeared once again while picking her nose, calling Wu Sun master and asking him if he would like to enhance himself. He can choose to strengthen one of his 6 core parts: the flower, stem, leaves, roots, fruits, or seeds. It looks like his hypothesis was right. He can indeed level up and enhance his body. Without hesitation, he chose to upgrade the stem in hopes of growing taller to be able to sunbathe even more efficiently. Spending 100 evolution points to enhance the stem at once made him feel the growth happening in real time. It was like his body was being stretched out. The stem enhancement was a success. His height has increased by a whopping 0.003 meters. Yes, 0.003 paltry meters. All that gloating and taunting to the flowers all around him just netted him a growth that does not even equal the length of a tiny bug. That whole 100 points just gave him 3 millimeters of increase. It was barely noticeable by any stretch of the metric. He was now back on the opinion that he was given an extremely lousy system. Ruhwa, still with her fingers picking her nose, assured him that this was just the first of many upgrades. Besides, 100 evolution points is too little for any significant upgrades. Even though he was given this system to make himself evolve, he might not even be able to surpass the surrounding tall flowers in the area at this rate. While he was yapping and yapping with endless complaints, a wasp was slowly making its way to the area of the flower bed. Downcast and disappointed with his current state, Wu Sun just unenthusiastically looked at the bug and meekly warned it not to sting him or anything. Wu Sun's disappointment regarding his situation quickly transformed from gloom to creeping anger. He poured all the frustrations he was feeling onto the nearby wasp. He does not even have any nectar, yet this guy was annoyingly buzzing all over the place and all around him. He was just not in the mood for any of this right now. Wu Sun kept on shouting angrily, and before he knew it, the bug had already accidentally entered his big mouth. Nothing can shut you up more effectively than accidentally putting a whole wasp inside your oral cavity. A mixture of fear and surprise painted Wu Sun's face. He was just slowly processing the fact that he accidentally swallowed a huge bug. He had been alive for a total of 17 years now, and he had never even eaten any raw food, let alone a giant hornet. Composing himself, he started reaching into his mouth and feeling all around to quickly spit the bug out to no avail. It looked like he had accidentally swallowed it whole. What's weirder was that it did not taste bad. Come to think of it, he kind of likes the taste of soil too. Maybe plants just have a twisted sense of taste. Following his accidental ingestion, Ruhua appeared again to excitedly congratulate him for completing the so-called first devouring. He will be rewarded with a blind box treasure chest that will require 10,000 evolution points to open. It contains a random reward ranging from evolution points to plant genes. It looks like he can get loot boxes just by devouring living creatures. This possibility could open some interesting developments. But the brutal caveat was he needed 10,000 evolution points to open the thing in the first place. This system of his is even more stingy than a goose. At this rate, the amount of one evolution point ticking every minute does not seem great at all. Still, Wu Sun had no other choice but to soldier it out for a whole 5 days. He has been working hard to sunbathe every day and absorbed all the water and nutrients he could take from the soil. He has finally accumulated exactly 10,000 evolution points today. All his fatigue vanished as he excitedly called on the system to open the damn chest. Ruhua jumped out to enthusiastically spend all the accumulated points to reveal the contents of the blind box. She congratulated Wu Sun for obtaining a B-rank vine gene. It can be used to fuse with his stem. The only thing it needed was his permission. With this vine gene fusing into his stem, this might just mean that he has the possibility of becoming one of those legendary tentacle monsters from some of those questionable videos. Also, B-rank does not sound bad for a starter plant gene at all. This possibility has also unlocked a new part of the system where all 6 of its core parts and corresponding abilities are displayed in a detailed manner. Wu Sun did not hesitate any longer. He screamed to start the fusion process at the top of his lungs. A green light full of vitality started emanating from the system and covering his entire body. It only took a few moments, and the prompt was already congratulating him for the successful fusion with the vine gene. The light of life has seemingly sparked inside Wu Sun. With this B-rank gene, his stem has gotten a whole lot stronger, sturdier, and more useful. With the vine gene, he can now transform his once short stem into thick vines. Wu Sun can use them to whip opponents or for binding play, whatever that means. From now on, Wu Sun wants to be called the tentacle monster. However, the reality was different. In reality, once Wu Sun accessed the vines, he couldn't get enough of them. He felt that they were very soft and flexible, as if he was manipulating his fingers in a human body. As a result, he found no better use for them than to bend them into figures in the air. However, that wasn't the most useful thing he could do with them. After reading the descriptions, he realized that in the future, he would also be able to unexpectedly attack the enemy from underground. The very next moment, he was already fantasizing about how he was massacring the wasps that might come next, and how he would capture their queen. But then his musings were interrupted by a buzzing sound from a wasp flying nearby. As if teasing, it flew in circles again, annoying the protagonist with its buzzing. Another appearance of a wasp made Wu Sun wonder if there was a wasp nest nearby. Deciding that this was the perfect opportunity for him to practice controlling his new vine, the protagonist launched it towards the wasp at breakneck speed. The vine was surrounded by green lightning bolts, causing Wu Sun to come up with the name Lightning Whip for this technique. Feeling danger approaching, the wasp turned around and saw the vine in front of him covered in a green glow, reaching out to grab it. And in the moment, it seemed like it was all over for the wasp. The distance that Wu Sun could extend his whips had reached its maximum, and as a result, no matter how hard he tried, he was unable to reach it. As he frustratedly lowered his whip, the protagonist tried to console himself and said to himself that he couldn't catch the big hornet so easily anyway, adding that the best solution would be to wait for it to come closer. Then he wondered if he could apply the enhancement he had seen before to the vines, perhaps making them thicker and longer. The wasp, meanwhile, hovered in the air and looked at Wu Sun with a haughty smile, as if trying to say that he was a loser who was not capable of anything. This arrogant behavior hurt the protagonist, but he continued to endure and did not show any signs, because he knew that if he could endure it now, the wasp would definitely relax and come closer. And even then, he would be able to take full revenge for his humiliation. When the moment seemed to have arrived and the wasp was close enough to be reached, Wu Sun shouted loudly that this time he wouldn't let it go. He released his vines at a great speed towards it. But to Wu Sun's surprise, his tentacle was not able to reach its target as it was intercepted by someone else a second before. This unexpected turn of events shocked not only the protagonist, but also the wasp itself, which did not understand what was happening. Wu Sun was furious and didn't even try to choose his words. All the curses he knew were used. The culprit was the yellow gecko, who was holding the wasp in his mouth and looking at the protagonist with a smile. Such insolence made Wu Sun furious, as he had no intention of sharing his food with anyone else at all. In the next moment, fire flared in his eyes, and he let out a fierce shout as he released his whips covered in green lightning bolts towards him, shouting that since he was taking away his food, he should be held responsible for it. Turning around, the gecko was confused to find that his tail was wrapped around some strange vine that held it tightly. Not wanting to be tied up, the gecko made an attempt to resist and try to escape, but unfortunately the vines held him very tightly, preventing him from doing so. Seeing that the lizard was resisting in a panic and trying to escape, Wu Sun gripped its tail even tighter and said in an irritated voice that its attempts were futile as he had no intention of letting it go so easily. However, in the next moment, something happened that the protagonist did not expect in any way. Part of the gecko's tail, which he was holding with his tentacles, suddenly separated from his body. And since the tension was quite strong, the whips, which flew backwards by inertia, hit him in the face with force. While the protagonist was recovering from the slap he had inflicted on himself, the gecko, not wanting to miss this chance, began to quickly get away from the dangerous plant, which was our protagonist. Wu Sun was both furious and confused as he realized that it was his fault for forgetting that lizards could throw back their tails. But he did manage to get something, and that was the tail, which remained in his tentacles. He decided it would be unwise to be upset about it, so he stuffed the rest of the tail into his mouth, adding that it was still better than nothing. After standing there gloomily for a while, waiting for the system's messages and hoping that he would get the treasure chest again, he had not received a single message in the meantime. However, Wu Sun realized that the only way to get the treasure chest reward was to eat an entire living creature. Scratching the back of his head, he complained in a somewhat dull voice that there were very few insects in the area. Even flies and ants, which are always plentiful everywhere, were nowhere to be found. A week later, an innocent beetle running by was grabbed by a green tentacle that suddenly appeared out of nowhere, and the next moment it went straight into the mouth of the protagonist, who opened it wide and ruthlessly ate the beetle, while the emotions of the flowers in the background changed from bewilderment to admiration. The next moment, a golden chest appeared in front of Wu Sun, accompanied by the voice of the system, which congratulated the protagonist for eating the dung beetle and obtaining the chest as a result, and informed him that 100,000 evolution points were required to open it. A note on the notification window that popped up also mentioned some rituals that could increase the chances of getting a good item. After reading this, the protagonist became furious, as there was no way he could perform them, since he was just an ordinary flower, and he would not be able to take a bath, light incense, or change his clothes. In addition, the realization that he had just eaten a dung beetle added to his anger. He decided to ignore it, however, as he was now just a flower with a big mouth that had grown out of alpaca dung. After calming down a bit, he told the system to let her open the chest. After the chest opened, it shone with a bright golden light. The system spirit Ruhua appeared out of nowhere and told the protagonist that this time he was rewarded with 200,000 evolution points. The protagonist, still reeling from having eaten a dung beetle, asked the spirit in an irritated voice why he needed to evolve at all if he was already garbage. To which the spirit replied that it was a plant system in which the weirder the food he ate, the higher the chance that he would get a good item from the chest. After listening to Ruhua's words, Wu Sun couldn't find anything to reply, and he had no desire to argue with the system spirit right now. After a while, the grass that was growing near Wu Sun rustled, and the next moment, the culprit who broke the silence appeared. It was the same yellow gecko that we had seen before, but this time it looked very frightened, and as if it was running away from someone. Not paying attention to the frightened look of the lizard, the protagonist with his toothy smile on his face asked him how he dared to come back here after taking away his prey. After which, with the words that the latter would pay for the wrongs he had done, Wu Sun lunged towards the gecko with his tentacle, using his skill lightning strike. However, suddenly something very similar to a tongue appeared behind the gecko fleeing in panic, which was also approaching it at a tremendous speed. Despite being caught between two crossfires, both the protagonist's whip and the unknown creature that was supposed to be the tongue's owner, the gecko miraculously managed to dodge. However, the lizard was no longer important to Wu Sun, as he was now more concerned with the creature that the gecko was fleeing from in panic, and the one who was the owner of the tongue. With his eyes wide open, the protagonist watched as the creature retracted its long tongue back. After that, a head covered in spikes appeared. As it turned out, in front of him was a huge frog whose skin was covered with spikes, while its eyes glowed threateningly with a red light. The frog pushed off the ground and jumped into the air, heading straight for our protagonist, who was frozen in place, unable to move. Having recovered from the shock, He desperately wondered why he was attacked by such a big frog. He had no time to despair, however, as his life hung in the balance. In addition, he was also caught up in the fact that the frog had abandoned its pursuit of the gecko and turned its attention to him, thinking that he was easy prey. The next moment he was out of his daze, and he swung his tentacle with all his might at the huge frog, shouting furiously for it to get out of here. It flipped in the air and fell to the ground with a thud, but the next moment it was standing on the ground. But in the next moment, it was already standing on its feet, staring at Wu Sun angrily with its red eyes that clearly showed its rage. Deciding not to wait for the frog to fully recover and attack him, the protagonist decided to attack first, swinging at it with his tentacle, which would act as a whip in this attack. As planned, the whip attack hit the target. However, it did not do the expected damage. After receiving the blow, the frog only squinted its eyes. In the next moment, the toad fiercely grabbed the tentacle of Wu Sun, who did not anticipate this outcome and did not have time to return it to him. The protagonist, meanwhile, was trying with all his might not to be dragged away by the frog, which had already begun to forcefully pull on his tentacle, and was pondering how the frog was able to repel his attack so easily. To his senses, it felt like he had hit a rock. But he had no more time to ponder, as the next moment, the frog stuck out its huge tongue and wrapped it around his stem. This action from the frog left Wu Sun confused as he didn't quite understand what it was going to do now. But in the next moment, everything became very clear. After all, the frog grabbed the stem of the main character and began to tear it out of the ground along with the roots. Realizing that now his beautiful new life could end, Wu Sun panicked and started to scream loudly and tried to resist. After the frog had firmly grasped his stem with his tongue, he began to pull with force, and our flower began to slowly separate from the ground, and when his stubs began to break off, he cried out, "It hurts." It hurt so much that he felt like his body was about to be torn apart. He now had a pressing question: do plants feel pain like animals? He continued to cling to the ground with his roots with tears in his eyes. Now he understood how all those poor plants, flowers, and grass felt, on which he had taken out all his anger in his past life. Now it seemed to him that the pain he was feeling was God's punishment for the pain he had once inflicted on the plants. The frog was inexorably pulling him harder and harder, ripping him out along with a piece of earth. Wu Sun realized that it seemed like it was all over for him now, as he would most likely die if he was uprooted from the ground. He could already see the cold breath of death at the back of his head. He didn't think he would feel it again so soon. But when there was no more hope, he noticed something, or rather someone, and he was surprised and frightened. A yellow gecko, already familiar to us, appeared on the branch above the frog. He did not understand what the little lizard was going to do, whether he wanted to avenge his lost tail or to help him with the frog. The gecko, in order not to lose his advantage of surprise and not to alert the frog with his finger, showed our flower to be silent and not to draw attention to him. Wu Sun was very surprised at this turn of events. How did the gecko know such gestures, and why did he look so smart? What kind of world had he gotten into, that all the beasts here were so smart and cunning? This could be a problem for him in the future if he lived to see it. The gecko didn't wait long and jumped at the frog from the branch. He landed right on its head between its ugly yellow eyes. And before the frog woke up from the surprise and had time to throw him off, he aimed his toothy mouth right at its eye. After his bite, dark blood gushed from the frog's eye. The frog would have howled from the pain if it could, but as it only made an incomprehensible sound and jumped up on the spot, it was forced to retract its tongue back, letting go of our toothy flower. The frog fell on its back, going to crush the pesky gecko, but it failed as it jumped off in time. But as long as the frog left the flower alone, this was his chance. Wu Sun sighed from fatigue and realizing how close he was to death, but he didn't have much time. Therefore, he immediately began to prepare for the attack and raised his battle whip. He wrapped it around the wounded frog and bound it tightly before it could even quack. Then he was going to throw it away with force and plow the ground in the clearing with it, which he eventually did. After that, he began to spin the frog, throwing it against the ground and then spinning it again. This made it dizzy, and its tongue fell out. But the frog had another trick up her sleeve that she was saving especially for situations like this. She let some slippery and smelly liquid out of her skin. And when it hit the whip, the frog just slipped off it and flopped to the ground. Our flower did not have time to react in time from such a surprise and was a little confused. He thought that the frog is already in his hands and it cannot escape. However, thanks to its trick, it has already successfully jumped away from this unfortunate flower, which brought it so much pain and trouble instead of a light snack. Our flower still tried to reach her with his whip, but it was already too late and the frog was running away from him in the distance. This situation made him very angry with our toothy flower, who was very close to dealing with the frog once and for all, but her tricks and ability to run fast saved her pimply skin. But nothing Now at least she wouldn't dare to come near him next time. Then he remembered how much it hurt him when the frog tried to pull him out of the ground and realized how vulnerable he was as a plant. He was dependent on soil, moisture, sun. He couldn't escape. He was very fragile and always in danger. Even a regular frog almost killed him. He sadly asked himself, would he ever be able to become human again? However, there was a silver lining. After his battle with the frog, he had a new friend, a small yellow gecko. He didn't speak, but waved at him with the rest of his tail. Flower didn't like this very much and tensed him up, so he asked what he was doing. Was he trying to ask forgiveness for bringing that nasty frog here? Without saying anything in reply, the gecko began to pick up pieces of soil with his paws. Then he took another pieces of soil and covered the bare roots with it under the surprised look of the flower. Wu Sun even started to shout at him that he was a little rascal who first brings trouble on his tail and then tries to make amends. But when he felt relief from the moisture and shade on his roots, he was a little more sympathetic to him, and even said with a toothy grin that since he had helped him with the frog and the soil, he would not be angry with him. Gecko seemed very glad that he wasn't being chased away. The gecko continued to rake the soil around the roots of the flower, and our hero was quite surprised that the gecko seemed to understand his words. He wondered if it was normal for the gecko to understand his words, if he knew how to use the environment to fight his enemies, if he knew how to use the soil to fertilize the plants. If that was the case, then the other question was what language was he speaking now? Was it a human language or the language of flowers or maybe animals? When the gecko finished fertilizing the flower, he turned around and was about to go about his business, but our hero decided to see if he understood him. So he shouted to him that since he was leaving, at least let him say goodbye properly. But it seemed that the gecko did not pay attention to his words and continued his movement. And he sighed disappointedly, and he thought he had really found a friend to talk to. As it turned out, the gecko didn't go far and stopped at the edge of their clearing of grass and paused for a moment. Then noticing movement in the grass, he caught a bug with his long and sticky tongue. And then with a satisfied smile like a dog who carries a ball to his master, he started to return to the flower. Gecko ran up to the flower and poked him in the cheek with his tongue, who did not understand what was happening and why he was poking him with his nasty tongue. He started to tell him that it is disgusting when someone pokes you with his slobbery tongue, but then the gecko showed him a bug on his tongue, which he apparently wanted to give him. He was making incomprehensible noises and pointing his finger at the bug as if offering to take it. Our flower was hungry enough, and realizing what the gecko was offering him, he opened his mouth pointing at it. But what was wrong in their pantomime, and they did not fully understand each other, because the gecko did not give him the bug, so the flower asked, what does he want? Was he afraid he would eat the bug along with its tongue? And it seemed to be true, because the gecko nodded happily in response. He thought that such a smart lizard could not be fooled, even if he wanted to. But he knew how to solve their situation, so he suggested that the gecko put the bug on the ground in front of him, and then he would deal with it since he didn't trust him. However, the gecko understood everything in his own way, and seemed to have decided that the flower could be trusted after all, and now he came closer with the bug on his tongue. Our flower didn't know how to react to all this. But his second confusion was not long, because he knew well the saying, when they give you take, if they hit you run, so he grabbed the bug with his whip and threw it into his toothy mouth. He hoped it would help him evolve. Surprisingly it did. Right after he swallowed the bug, the spirit of Ruhwa and information windows appeared in front of him, congratulating him on getting the next random treasure chest thanks to eating a live bug. He again needed to accumulate 10,000 evolution points to open the chest. Also, after a certain number of open crates, he would be able to get an additional reward. There was also a funny note that warned that before opening a treasure chest, it was worth taking a bath, changing clothes, lighting incense, and praying to all known gods. This was supposed to increase the probability of rare items falling out, but it's not certain. Also, after all the notifications, the system would ask him if he wanted to open the chest since he had enough points. Ruhwa looked at the yellow gecko with interest. Our hero, upon seeing his gaze, explained that it was his new friend whom he met during the battle with the uninvited guest. Then Wu Sun turned to his new friend and asked if he wanted to help him open the treasure chest as a reward for his help. Gecko simply stared at him questioningly in response. This behavior did not please Ruhwa, who was sitting on the chest with a frown. Our flower realized that he was wrong again and overestimated the level of intelligence of the gecko, and decided to simplify everything for him as much as possible and choose one of the two phrases, open the chest and do not open the chest. And who would have thought the joyful gecko made a sound similar to open? Our hero was pleased with the progress in their communication and turning to his system spirit Ruhwa, told him to open the chest since that's what even the lizard said. An information box appeared, congratulating him on obtaining a B-level vine gene that could be integrated into the stem and asking if he wanted to use it now. Also under the illustration of the vine, its properties and benefits to the plant were explained. But since he already had one vine integrated, the system offered him two options for gene fusion. The first option was to upgrade and strengthen the existing vine. The second was to add another additional vine. And further, the skill was offered to choose one of the options for its development. Our hero was very happy about the opportunity to develop, and was not shy to tell everyone around him about it. He stroked his already tame gecko and praised it, because thanks to it he got a good level item. But now he was faced with a difficult choice, which way to go to strengthen his vine or to get an additional one. As he pondered, he recalled the details of his fight with the frog, and realized that he had almost been uprooted because he didn't have enough vines. That was why he had chosen the second option. Hearing his answer, Ruhua pulled out his magic fairy wand and announced that there would now be a fusion of his stem with the new gene. Our hero was engulfed in streams of green energy, and the next system window appeared, where our flower was congratulated on the integration of another gene that allowed him to turn his stems into whips to fight his enemies. It could also now officially refer to itself as a tentacle monster. True with only 2 tentacles, but that didn't matter. Wu Sun was expecting something more, and he began to resent the thin and short whip he had been given. Wasn't there something bigger and prettier? Ruhua replied that not everything is so fast, and there are no shortcuts. He has already accumulated a lot of evolution points, and he is sure that our flower will become longer and thicker in the near future, just like everyone dreams of. Wu Sun was annoyed by such worthless whines he got from the system, so he asked the system spirit if the system couldn't be more serious and give him normal improvements instead of this mockery. But Ruhua's system spirit was determined to convince his little master that the system is always completely serious, and this is the way of gradual evolution. Our protagonist realized that there was no point in arguing with him, and he was just too lazy to deal with him. So he simply told him to disappear from his sight and stop annoying him. After getting rid of the annoying system spirit, he turned his attention to his new friend, and decided to offer him a mutually beneficial deal. Since he had helped the gecko escape from the big frog, and the gecko had offered him food in gratitude, it meant that the little creatures knew how to be grateful, and he planned to use that to his own advantage. Wu Sun offered the gecko a deal, saying that in the future, if there was any threat, he could just come to him, and he would protect him. In exchange for just one condition, he would have to catch a bug for him every day. He thought to himself that this would be a brilliant move since he couldn't move, and his whips had a limited radius. But with a mobile partner to help him catch bugs, he could level up very quickly. The gecko didn't seem to be at all thrilled with this offer and looked at him incredulously. Wu Sun began to reason that bringing him bugs would not only benefit him but also the gecko, because then he would be able to provide more security, thanks to the fact that he would be stronger himself. The gecko seemed to be satisfied with this explanation and no longer looked at him so disgruntled. He seemed to agree to his terms. Wu Sun exhaled a sigh of relief and assured him that since they had agreed, he would not let him down. Then he asked the gecko if he could call him Little Yellow. He didn't seem at all thrilled at this idea. Seeing his expression, Wu Sun was indignant and asked what was wrong with his appearance. Doesn't he like his new name? He had to blame his poop-colored appearance for everything. Whatever, back in the day he was a top student in high school rocket class. And now when he gave him a name, how could he complaining? A few days later, after accumulating enough evolution points and eating another bug, he was able to open the box from which he got the B-rank plant gene, Kang-er. Fuse location for this gene was seed, and then system asked if he wanted to fuse. This gene was taken from some annual herb. The seed of this plant have hooked thorns that could attach to passing animals' bodies. Wu Sun was happy that with the help of his little yellow mascot, he was able to unlock the new plant gene in a few days. But he still wondered how he would be able to use this gene after the fusion if it was in the seeds. At his command, a system spirit appeared and immediately helped him to make the gene fusion. The fusion was successful, and the system congratulated him for obtaining the new gene. Now he could throw spiky Kang-er and give his opponents a full body massage. And also the refreshing taste of his seeds would be unforgettable. The system warned him to be careful when talking to his friends and opponents so as not to accidentally throw a bunch of Kang-er at their face. However, when he heard the place where the spiky seeds would appear from, our hero was not at all thrilled about the whole thing. He asked the service spirit if these seeds would cut his throat. The Ruhua service spirit didn't seem to be in a hurry to answer his question and instead picked his nose. Finally retrieving some gold from there, he immediately threw it at the irritated Wu Sun's head. Ruhua, despite his actions, called him his little master and assured him that everything would be fine. All he had to do was open his mouth a bit wider and make a retching sound and all seeds came out. It's as simple as picking nose. Wu Sun decided to try and unpleasant sounds filled the clearing. In the end, he was able to spit out a lot of thorny seeds. After that, he immediately coughed and through his coughing began to reproach the spirit how he could betray his trust. although it's not the intense pain of a cut throat, but his throat felt scorched from the scratching. The spirit nonchalantly replied to him that great power comes at a high price, little master. He advised him to ignore the sore throat and give the power of Kang-er a try. In the end, he had no choice but to learn how to use this power, so he decided to touch the seeds with one of his vines. It turned out that even though these Kang-er looked quite sharp, he found out that he felt no pain from them when he touched them with his vine. Surprisingly, it doesn't hurt, and that was because his vines became tough and thick after upgrading. And in that case, he could afford to let his creativity run wild and realize some of his bold ideas. He'd already figured out how to amuse himself with the seeds. To do this, he gave the gecko a dry leaf and asked him to stand away. The gecko took the dry leaf in his paws and looked at him questioningly, not understanding what he should do with it. But Woo-sun hurried him up and asked him why he was standing there like a log. But seeing the gecko's incredulous gaze, he had to convince him not to worry, because he would definitely not fool him. When the gecko had gotten far enough away, our protagonist told him to stop and stand there. He cheerfully announced, "Watch this, here comes a little flying whip," and he threw the spike, aiming for the dry leaf in the gecko's clutches. But he didn't hit what he was aiming for, and instead of a leaf, he shot the gecko's tail off again. The gecko didn't even realize what had happened. The gecko only noticed that something was wrong when pieces of its tail began to wriggle behind him. Woo-sun realized that he had done something wrong and apologized, assuring the poor gecko that it was not on purpose. But his apology couldn't bring the poor thing's tail back, and he was showing it very clearly with his look. His look pissed off our hero, who shouted furiously to him, "What's with that contemptuous look? How he dare to look down like that on his big brother?" Then he immediately decided to correct himself and try again, being sure that it was only an accidental mistake and now he would succeed. And to everyone's surprise, he hit the leaf. But not the one he was aiming at. Gecko realized that he was hopeless, and it was only a matter of time before something else got shot off. It turned out that all the thorny seeds he had thrown were nowhere near the target, and had hit all the bushes with the accuracy of a sniper, leaving them no chance. For such outstanding services, Woo-sun definitely deserved to be rewarded with the lizard body outlining master medal, but he did not give up, reassuring himself that just today his accuracy was a bit off. But that was okay, because with diligent practice he will surely improve his throwing skills and become a ninja master at accuracy. A few more days passed like that. Gecko continued to hunt bugs, terrorizing the local arthropod fauna, and judging by the number of insects in his mouth, he was very successful at it. Having finished the hunt, he began to make a hole in the withered tree inside the trunk of which rainwater was collecting. And when the hole was ready and dirty water was pouring out of it, the gecko began to pour it into a bowl. The poor fellow was sweating from the continuous work, but still he hurried to his friend Flower. While the gecko was working hard, our Flower was just basking in the sun and eating remaining bugs, talking about his hard life and complaining that Little Yellow was delayed. He was hungry and didn't understand why he still felt hungry after being a plant. But as soon as he heard a noise from the bushes, he immediately put all his thoughts aside. When he saw a gecko with a bowl in his paws, he thought that as soon as he spoke of the devil, he would immediately appear. But all his resentment was taken away when the gecko gave him a bowl of water and even filled his mouth with water and showered him with an improvised rain. Woo-sun praised Little Yellow, telling him that he is smart, learns quickly, and even knows how to use a bowl for water. But it seems that all his cleverness did not extend to how to transport the bugs, because he kept them in his salivating mouth, and when he spit them out on the ground in front of our Flower, they were completely covered with his unpleasant liquid. So Woo-sun advised him to find some tree bark next time he catches bugs and put them there. It would be much more hygienic than that. But this time he was hungry enough to ignore a little thing like this and started eating the bugs. After devouring a few bugs, the ugly system spirit reappeared in front of him and congratulated him on getting another chest for eating green-headed fly. This chest needed 10000 evolution points to open as always, and Ruhwa asked him if he wanted to open it now. But Woo-sun decided to save it for later. Right now, he didn't want new upgrades since he hadn't learned how to use Kang-er properly yet. And on top of that, the ground under the scorching sun had become too dry, so he had to ask Little Yellow to fetch some water to help him grow more vigorously. Sipping water and juggling his thorny seeds, Woo-sun enjoyed his life, and even said that this is the laid-back life he wanted, and it feels good to have someone who feeds him. After finishing his water, he decided to try his hand at throwing spiky Kang-ers again. But even though this time the gecko held 3 leaves at once, he still didn't hit even one. Even the massive volley that followed didn't help, and he didn't hit once again. Just reaffirmed the title of the most accurate marksman in the Wild West, and he didn't hit even once. But that didn't seem to spoil his mood, because he had enough time and bug snacks to keep practicing. So he ordered his little yellow friend to collect and bring him all the Kang-er. Woo-sun didn't even realize that he was under close surveillance. His arch-nemesis who had come for revenge was a big bullfrog. It was waiting for the right moment to attack an unsuspecting victim, which was a gecko who went to collect the kang scattered around the clearing. When he had already collected everything and was about to leave, the toad suddenly jumped out of the bushes. Even Woo-sun's shouts to the gecko to be careful didn't help, and the toad with its long, sticky tongue embraced the poor gecko, who could do nothing. Our flower could only watch his little yellow friend disappear into the frog's bottomless mouth. Poor gecko screamed for the last time and disappeared. When Frog closed its jaws, it already seemed that the unenviable fate of the gecko had come to an end. Woo-sun couldn't believe that his friend had died so quickly. He cried out desperately and violently, "Little Yellow," while still trying to reach the toad with his whips, but it was already too late to do something. The gecko's situation was not enviable. He was still alive, but inside the toad he wouldn't be able to stay that way for long. The poor thing was trapped inside the giant's stomach, which was clenching every now and then, but he still hadn't released the spiny seeds from his paws, and that gave him hope of escape. Showing all his ingenuity, he took a few thorns in his paws and began to actively stab the toad from the inside with them. The toad's eyes widened with pain. The first time it had eaten its victim, it was struggling so hard in its stomach. It couldn't take the pain any longer and began to prepare to spit out its spiny lunch. The toad spat out the entire contents of its stomach along with the gecko in streams of vile slime. Woo-sun had already said goodbye to his friend and was surprised to see him again. He didn't understand why the frog spat him out. Was he as unpleasant to taste as his poop-colored appearance? With one swipe of its paw, the toad threw its stinky and prickly prey away from its tongue. Woo-sun, seeing all this, remembered how he had once seen an online video of a toad swallowing a farting bug and then spitting it out. So when toads eat something poisonous, they regurgitate their stomach to clean it. In the end, he happily concluded that it was because Little Yellow was holding the kang in his paws, so he hurried the gecko back to him with the prickly seeds. But because he was holding the seeds in his front paws, his speed was very slow, and the toad had already managed to gulp back its stomach. And the toad's eyes lit up with rage and annoyance at the fact that its prey was leaving right under its nose. The toad couldn't just let it go and jumped again with its mouth wide open, about to swallow the unfortunate gecko again. But because of this jump, it got within range of our flower's whips, and he spread his whips and asked the toad how she dared to come again. Doesn't she remember how it ended last time? This time, having two whips at once, he would not let her leave alive. The toad appeared to be ready for the first attack and dodged it. It even managed to grab one of the whips, just like last time, and tried to reach her tongue into the flower to finally pluck it out of the ground. Well, something didn't go according to plan. After all, the flower's vines were now too long, longer than the toad's tongue, and it just couldn't reach for him. Woo-sun only laughed at her pathetic attempts and asked her what she was hoping for trying the same move against him second time. Hadn't she noticed the change? Our flower's vines were now longer, thicker, and stronger, and were already beginning to entangle the helpless toad. After tying her up tighter, he began to pull her towards him. The poor thing resisted as much as it could and struggled with all its might, but its fate was already decided. Because bound, she was completely in the power of our flower, and now he could easily lift her into the air, depriving her of any support under her feet. And then with such force to land her back on the ground head downward, that the stony soil scattered in all directions. From such a blow, the toad's eyes darkened and she lost consciousness. Seeing how frozen the toad was, Woo-sun smugly advised it, "Don't think I can't handle you just because you're petrified." He also decided to ask her a math problem to tell her that if he spit out 5 kangers every day, how many kangers will he have spat out in total after 10 days? The answer was nearby, where a pile of his spiky seeds were stacked. Expectedly, without waiting for a response from the toad, he wrapped his vines around it and sent it flying straight toward the pile of thorns. He slammed it into the thorn pile once. It seemed that his rage for all his suffering was overwhelming him, because he didn't stop there and kept hitting the poor toad again and again. Even the gecko was shocked by this cruelty and nervously imagined that he could have been in her shoes if he hadn't befriended this crazy flower. Woo-sun finally calmed down only when the entire clearing was covered in clouds of dust, and the toad was no longer showing any signs of life, looking more like a chop. He ironically asked it, "Not bouncing back this time, huh?" After such a beating, it wasn't hard for the flower to cut up the dead toad, and as he separated the toad's leg, he smugly praised himself for defeating such a large opponent. As it turned out, he hadn't expected his thorny seeds to help him hand-slay enemies. Otherwise, he couldn't have swallowed such a big one. Woo-sun wasn't greedy and decided to share a piece of his victory with his shocked little friend. But seeing his indecision, he had to tell him, "Come on, buddy, you should share with me the fortune and misfortune, so let's eat together." Hearing this, the joyful gecko immediately pounced on the food. Woo-sun also started eating, and had to admit that the toad tastes pretty good. But he wondered if the system would give him a chest for eating the toad in pieces, Since the last time he ate a piece of the gecko's tail, he didn't get anything. But he didn't have to guess for long, as the next moment, a disgusting system spirit appeared with 2 chests. Wu Sun did not pay attention to the appearance of the spirit, but was only happy to receive 2 chests at once. He had a logical question. Why didn't he get any when he swallowed the gecko tail last time? And when he ate just 1 piece of the big toad now, did he get 2 chests at once? Ruhua, looking at the gecko eating the meat with such gusto, didn't seem to be sure why the flower was so lucky. So he answered him in no uncertain terms that apparently the system considered killing the big creature and eating the first bite to be a sufficient condition for getting the chests. But in general, the rules for getting chests were a bit different. For small creatures that the host can swallow in 1 bite, there is a 100% chance of getting a box. As for larger creatures that require a chewing, there's a chance of getting a box with each bite. However, all of this also depends on luck. If luck is bad, even if the host eats a whole toad bursting the stomach, it might only yield 1 box. After hearing all these explanations, Wu Sun decided to continue eating the toad, and literally after the next bite, he got the chest again. Ruhua was not at all pleased with such luck of our hero, and Wu Sun was just glowing with happiness and anticipation of what he could get from them. And now he smugly asked if the fact that he had gotten so many chests meant that his luck was extremely good? After all, he had gotten 3 boxes in just 3 bites. System Spirit Ruhua merely grudgingly hummed in response, and not at all sincerely wished him luck in the next bites. Wu Sun didn't understand what he meant, but sensed that he didn't want anything good for him really, and advised him to look at his ugliness instead of making caustic remarks. After a little while, our flower and the gecko were full enough and couldn't make even 1 more bite. However, in all this time, our flower didn't get any more chests, which of course made him very angry, and he blamed everything on that nasty system spirit, who could have done all this on purpose. For since he said that sentence earlier, not even bursting his stomach resulted in a chest. But Ruhua, picking his nose, had no problem justifying himself by saying that it was just a problem with his luck, and there was nothing he could do about that moody lady luck. Lastly, he asked if he wanted to open the chests now. Wu Sun refused on the grounds that he wasn't interested in opening the chests at all, as he had so much left to eat right now. Despite his and Gecko's best efforts, they were only able to eat half of the toad, which was already an achievement considering their size. But something had to be done with the other half, because if it wasn't dealt with properly, such a big chunk of meat would surely attract carnivores, who could easily destroy our flower with a single swipe of their paws. But Wu Sun was not stupid, and in his head came up with a brilliant idea how to deal with the toad's corpse and at the same time get the most out of it. Since it could not only eat through its mouth, the protagonist decided that a great idea would be to bury the body, thus turning it into organic fertilizer, which would allow him to absorb nutrients little by little through the roots without any competition. Ever since he was a kid, he remembered his mom burying meat or fish in the ground, and to his curious questions about why she did it, she answered that microorganisms in the soil decomposed the bodies of dead fish into carbon dioxide, water, and inorganic substances. And it was these that were absorbed by the fruit trees, so that they grew faster and gave more tasty crops. However, the protagonist had a problem. His vines were not designed to dig into the ground at all. After thinking about it, he realized that he could solve this problem quite easily if he could find tools that he could wrap around the vines. However, the second problem was that shovel-like digging tools were unlikely to be found here. His only salvation was his yellow friend, whom he immediately asked to find thick branches and scaly rocks for him. He folded his vines into roughly the shape he wanted and showed them to the gecko, who stared at them intently. After a few minutes, the gecko turned around and headed somewhere. As he stared at the gecko, the protagonist could only hope that he understood what he wanted. After a while, several branches of different thicknesses and a small stone were lying on the ground in front of him. The gecko who had brought it all was looking at him happily, as if expecting praise. However, Wu Sun didn't really appreciate his efforts. Easily breaking the branches with his vines, he said that these branches were not suitable as they were very thin and would break very easily. Picking up some soil with his leaf, he added that the soil here was very soft, so he needed something thin and strong. Hearing this and silently staring at the broken branches, after a moment of silent staring at the broken branches, Gecko seemed to understand, nodded his head and rushed off. However, he did not manage to bring the necessary tools for the first time. He brought a leaf or a lump of soil, which was obviously not solid at all. Even though he was tired, he brought a huge log that Wu Sun didn't know what to do with because he could hardly move it. However, this was not what he needed, and he even thought that he had overestimated the IQ of his yellow friend. Suddenly, however, 2 objects fell to the ground in front of him, a sharpened bone as well as a broken arrowhead. His eyes immediately widened with surprise. After grabbing the arrow, he couldn't be happy with it, because even though it was broken and rusty, it was still what he needed. It was also made of iron, which could mean that there were other intelligent beings in this continent who knew how to use tools. Grabbing the bone and arrowhead with his vines, he immediately got into a threatening fighting stance, saying that these two sharp objects could be good weapons for him. And if he was attacked by a toad again, he would be able to slit its belly easily. Praising the gecko for finding what he needed, he tossed him the bone and added that they had some work to do. They started digging together. After a while, a rather large hole appeared in the ground. Wiping sweat with a vine, Wu-sun turned to the same tired gecko and said that it was time to drag the frog's body into the hole. The gecko immediately started dragging it. After putting it in the hole and covering it with soil, he jumped on it a little to trample it completely, sniffing the air and noting that the smell of blood was gone, so the predators had no reason to come here anymore. He wondered why he, being a plant, could smell the odors. As he began to absorb water, sunlight, and nutrients again, he noted that nothing had changed yet. However, he realized that he had rushed things, as the microorganisms needed time to decompose the frog's body. Accepting that this method was not as fast as absorbing it directly, he remembered the 3 chests he had been able to obtain earlier that he had not yet opened. Calling the system spirit, he told him that he would like to open them. The system spirit immediately appeared and told him that since there were 3 chests, he had given them their serial numbers and asked which one he wanted to open first. Turning to the gecko, the protagonist asked him which one he would like to open. He told him to just name a number between 1 and 3. To which the gecko extended his paw and showed the number 2. Hearing this, Wu-sun told Ruhua to open the second treasure chest. As soon as the chest was opened, the system spirit immediately congratulated his master for obtaining a B-level plant gene called spikes. It was a very good gene that he could also integrate into his vines. Patting the satisfied gecko on the head, Wu-sun said that the one was indeed the best. Wanting to quickly test his new skills, he told Ruhua to apply the fusion. In the next instant, his vines were covered with thorns, which combined with his fighting stance looked very intimidating. The system window said that the thorn gene made his vines thicker, longer, and stronger, and they were covered in sharp thorns. The note jokingly reported that he was now a rose with thorns. Looking at his vines with a villainous smile, he said that now he finally had real lightning whips. Deciding to test their power, he immediately started swinging them at great speed, hitting the leaves, which immediately created holes. The result was beyond his expectations, as it was powerful enough to even seriously injure the horned toad. He decided not to stop, and asked his yellow friend to choose one of the remaining numbers, to which he replied number 3. The remaining chests only had double the points. Looking at them, Wu-sun said that as expected, the chance of a skill falling out was 33%, adding that the gecko was still better than him, as even though he had opened 10 chests, nothing of value had fallen out. He decided not to dwell on it, but to be happy with what he had already gotten, because with the new gene, broken arrow, and bone, his combat power had increased significantly. Now he just had to wait for the right opportunity to realize it. After a while, the silence was broken by the rustling of the grass, and Wu-sun shouted, telling the gecko to keep running. I guess he was going to do it without his words, because the big horned frog was jumping after him, and he was hardly just playing catch-up with it. However, salvation was at hand, as soon as they got close enough, the protagonist released his spike-covered vines in their direction with lightning speed. Upon reaching the toad, they instantly bound its body, doing further damage to it with the barbed thorns that pierced its skin. Having watched many movies, and knowing that it was better to finish off the enemy for sure, Wu-sun made a controlling strike with it against the ground. After a while, after cutting the frog meat into pieces with the broken arrow, he called his yellow friend to eat. After that, they started to enjoy the juicy and nutritious frog meat together. Suddenly something caught the main character's attention, making him look up. As it turned out, it was the system spirit Ruhua, who appeared out of nowhere and joyfully began to congratulate him on receiving the treasure chests, which this time was even more. Hearing this, the protagonist with a smile said finally. He waited for the upgrade opportunity for a while, and today that moment come. After a while, after eating the last of the meat and making a burp, he declared that he was full. Sitting down with a puffed-up belly, he happily announced that this time he was able to get as many as 5 chests. And since the gecko warrior already couldn't fulfill his duty of choosing a chest, he had to do it himself, so he simply told Ruhua to open the middle one. Shining with a golden light, the chest opened. As it turned out, the reward from the chest this time was a B-level sweet potato gene, with which his system spirit immediately congratulated him on. The system window reported that sweet potato roots were divided into 3 forms: fibrous, woody, and tuberous. It was also reported that the main function of tuberous roots was to store nutrients and reproduce. After reading this, Wu-sun wondered if he even needed this gene. Turning to the system spirit, he asked what the benefits of this gene were after the fusion. The system spirit immediately began to explain, saying that if he just buried the food scraps in the soil and let them decompose, it would take a long time and was wasteful. The sweet potato gene, on the other hand, allowed the processed food to be stored in the roots. Upon hearing this, the protagonist asked incredulously, what was the use of roots that hid nutrients? Did they really need to be dug up and eaten when hungry? However, Ruhwa refuted his theory, saying that he directly took nutrients from there, which could allow him to thrive even when food was scarce, as well as treat his injuries and recover quickly. Hearing this, Wu Sun immediately had an image in his mind in which the bottle of recovery potion in his hand was his roots. This made his eyes glisten even more with anticipation, and he immediately impatiently told the spirit to quickly start fusing. In the next second, the protagonist was surrounded by a bright green light, while the system window reported that he had successfully merged with the red potato gene, which allowed him to quickly break down food into nutrients and store them in the roots. The note said that now his mother would no longer have to worry about his malnutrition. However, to his bewilderment and confusion, he did not feel any obvious change. Seeing his confusion, Ruhwa told him to try using his mind to manipulate the roots and allow them to store food inside him. Hearing this, Wu Sun stared at the toad. But in the next moment, he did not take his eyes off of it, and as if reading an incantation, he began to mutter words about wanting to store food. A moment later, he could feel the roots, which immediately rushed to the top. After breaking through from the ground, they immediately began to braid the frog's body. Seeing this, the protagonist could not help but rejoice that everything worked, and also so quickly. He could clearly feel the root systems wrapping around the food and carrying it to the root for storage. It was incredibly convenient, because now he no longer had to dig holes and worry about someone eating his food, or it attracting the attention of others. On a future hunt, he decided to test the restorative effect of the sweet root, which was analogous to a bottle of recovery potion that could be equated to one life. And if the root was improved, he would have even more lives, and the probability of him surviving would increase greatly. The opportunity to test the new skill did not have to wait long, because after a while, he was attacked by a large red snake, which immediately rushed at the protagonist. However, he did not plan to lose, and controlling his thorny vines was able to stop her. However, he didn't stop there. He immediately took advantage of its hiccup, wrapped his vines around it, and slammed it to the ground. Realizing that the snake was still alive, Wu Sun used his secret technique called the enraged killer gecko that killed exclusively with bones. At a tremendous speed, he forcefully thrust the bone into the body of immobilized snake. After a while, the dust that was raised during the fight began to disperse. On the ground, the dead snake was still twitching in its death convulsions. While Wu Sun praised his yellow friend and said that they made a great team. Then turning his gaze to his vines, which had snakebite marks, he noted that even though the snake was poisonous, it was not a problem for him because snake poison is useless against plants. Snake poison acts through the bloodstream and attacks the nervous system, muscles, heart, and respiratory system. Fortunately, our flower didn't have any of that. The next moment his root glowed with a bright green light, indicating that healing had begun. A few seconds later, after inspecting his vine from which any wounds had disappeared, he proudly noted that this healing ability from his root was very good. However, nothing could be more important than dinner, which they happily picked up their improvised cutlery and immediately began to eat. While they were enjoying the snake meat, dark clouds covered the sky and rain began to fall. Ruhwa, sitting on the chest, hid under an umbrella, while the protagonist along with the gecko were without shelter. But Wu Sun immediately remedied this by weaving his vines into a canopy to protect him and his yellow friend from the rain. Looking at the contented gecko, who was sleeping peacefully and snuggled up to him, he said to himself that he felt more and more attached to his territory, for here he now had food, drink, and a cute little pet. For a moment, he said dreamily, the only thing he was missing was a girl. However, a premonition of impending danger brought him to his senses, and he looked perplexedly ahead of him. As it turned out, there was an amorous system spirit flying straight toward him, who spread his arms and asked if he was his girlfriend. However, a few barbed balls thrown at him quickly remedied the situation. Having fought off the attack of Ruhwa, who was now lying knocked out, the protagonist wondered if he should look for a large female flower if he wanted to find a girl. However, the image that appeared in his head did not particularly please him, so he decided to leave it for later. It's been over a month since our protagonist turned into a flower. During this time, he managed to grow another spiky vine, as well as 2 more roots, which equaled 2 more bottles of healing potion. Throwing the spiky ball into the air and catching it again, Wu Sun boredly wondered why his yellow friend hadn't returned from the hunt yet. Suddenly, the sound of rustling leaves behind him caught his attention. Turning around, he wondered if the gecko had finally returned from hunting. But what he saw made him freeze in shock. There was a man standing there with a backpack on his back and a hiking bag for herbs hanging from his shoulder. While the man was looking around, Wu Sun couldn't be happy that there were also people in this world. In an attempt to attract attention, he immediately started waving leaves and shouting loudly and happily, saying that he had finally met some of live people in this cursed world. But the next moment he realized that he himself was just a strange flower with a big mouth, and that the only thing he had in common with humans was the ability to think and speak. So first he decided to say hello and connect. Since he didn't know much about this world, he was going to ask the man a lot of questions. He immediately started yelling loudly. However, without noticing the protagonist, the man passed by. Watching the man bending over the ground, Wu Sun was puzzled as to why he didn't notice him, and whether it was because he was small. But what interested him even more was what he was doing now. Suddenly there was the sound of roots being pulled from the ground. With a smile that seemed devilish to the protagonist, the man happily said that he didn't expect there to be such a precious toxin-cleansing plant. This scene before the protagonist made him realize two things. First, that the man was gathering herbs, and second, that attracting attention was the biggest mistake he had ever made in his life. After sticking a small shovel into the ground, the man began to dig up the flower. He held it in his hand and said in a joyful voice that he was incredibly lucky to find such a flower, because it was the main ingredient for the longevity pill. The protagonist, on the other hand, was watching all of this with apprehension. Turning his gaze to himself, he panicked and said to himself that he was now the only flower in the area, and he hoped that perhaps he would not pluck it and use it to make medicine. However, his hopes were not to be realized. Putting the flower in his bag, the man looked around and thought that there must be other valuable herbs in the area. After the man's words, Wu Sun's eyes widened in horror, and the hope he had had vanished in an instant, for he realized that this was his end. As expected, the man discovered him rather quickly while smiling his devilish smile. However, he did not immediately tear it off. Pensive, he wondered why he didn't have any information about this flower. Taking out a book, he decided to check if there were any entries about this flower in it. But to his disappointment, he couldn't find anything. This interested him greatly, and the manic smile of a discoverer appeared on his face. Thinking that he had discovered a new medicinal herb, the man holding a shovel in his hand, which to the protagonist was tantamount to a murder weapon, reached out to Wu Sun, intending to dig it up and study it later. Our flower was frozen in fear, and could only stare at the hand reaching for him, and mentally shouted at him not to touch him with his filthy hands. Luckily, his survival instincts kicked in, and he unknowingly struck the man with a thorny vine, which the man's hand stumbled on. When he felt the pain, he immediately cried out painfully and yanked his hand away sharply. Looking at the torn glove on his hand, he wondered why the strange flower had so many thorns. However, their presence only made him more interested, and he decided to continue, but now to be more careful. His hand, accompanied by a devilish smile, reached for the protagonist again. Only this time, Wu Sun really realized that this was his end, because even with his thorny vine, he was only able to cause minimal damage. With a look of horror on his face, he resigned himself to the fact that he was powerless against absolute power. The man's hand was about to grab him. But suddenly he was distracted by a noise behind him, causing him to turn around. A silhouette was approaching them. Recognizing his partner, the man asked him why he had returned so quickly. He was carrying a large pink egg in his hands. When the man saw him, he was surprised and asked him how he could do it so quickly. However, to his bewilderment, the man said nothing and ran past him as if he was in a hurry. When he turned around, he shouted in panic that he should run away too, because the dragoness had noticed that he had stolen the egg. These words shocked and horrified him, and sweat immediately broke out on his face. While the guy with the egg in a panic continued to run away, his partner looked up into the sky and saw a large silhouette that was approaching them at a great speed. It was none other than a huge dragon whose mood was as horrible as its appearance. However, even after seeing dragon, the man did not leave the desire to dig up the strange flower. But his friend called him crazy and shouted that it was not the time for that. The protagonist was also not very happy about this, and irritatedly thought to himself why he did not just get out of here. Despite the extreme situation and his friends shouting, he was still hesitant. But even this greedy guy valued his miserable life, so he followed his friend and turned around and said that he would definitely come back as soon as he had a chance. Hearing these words, Wu Sun finally became furious, as he couldn't risk his life, and let them turn back later and finish what they wanted. Therefore, his only option was to fight, and luckily at that moment, he had every chance to win, for he wasn't the only one hostile against them. He had a dragon on his side. With fierce shouts that they should pay the price so that they would not dare to return again, he released his spiky vines in their direction, which in the next moment bound the legs of the fleeing guys, preventing them from moving. When they felt it, they looked down in bewilderment, trying to understand what had happened. They were indignant, for the thorny vines held their legs tightly. Not understanding how this could happen, they forcefully tried to break through. Even though the main character was not quite ordinary, he was still only a small flower for now, and so the strength of the two men was too huge for him. However, even though he was almost ripped out of the ground, he didn't plan to give up. With a fierce shout, he continued to hold their legs. Luckily, his strength was enough, and the two men fell face down on the ground with a clatter. A large pink egg fell out of his hands and rolled into the bushes. At the same time, the enraged dragon, glaring with its red eyes, was about to catch up with them. The brunette was puzzled as to what had stopped him, while the other was more concerned with where the egg had gone. However, they didn't have time to think about it, because the next moment the guy raised his head and shouted shrilly that the dragon was already over their heads. Shouting words of help, they ran away with all their might, despite it was already useless to try to do anything. In the next instant, the dragon's huge clawed paws reached for them. Dragon mercilessly grabbed the guys who were screaming in fear and roared at them in such a way that his intentions were very clear at once. However, even though he was in the dragon's clutches, the blonde-haired boy, though confused and shitting his pants, was still not going to give up. Smiling and reaching for his sword, he said in a determined voice that he would fight to the last moment. Then he swung his sword, striking the huge reptile's paw. When it felt the pain, it let out a piercing scream. In the next moment, the brunette felt that the dragon's paw was no longer holding him, but this wasn't good news. In the next moment, he and his partner began to rapidly approach the ground, threatening to crash to death. However, Dragoness did not stop there. Being in a rage, she was not going to give them such an easy death. So in the next instant, she opened her jaws and rushed towards them at a great speed. A few seconds later, the screams disappeared. It was said that those guys were never seen again after that. Looking at the dust that had already begun to settle, as if unable to believe it, the protagonist wondered if those two people were dead. The realization that he had committed an indirect but still a murder made his body sweat and he began to tremble. His reaction was quite normal, since for a boy of his age, murder was something very scary. However, he realized that he had no other choice, because if they had escaped, they would surely come back and he would be the one to die. Wu Sun decided not to dwell on it and thought that he had done it purely in self-defense and survival, so it was not his fault. However, in the next moment, another possible problem came to him. The dragon egg that had been lost in a hurry by those two guys, and which was currently lying nearby, making it likely that the dragoness would surely return later and kill everyone who would be nearby. Just then, he sensed an approaching danger behind him, causing him to turn around sharply. As expected, it was a dragoness flying low over the ground, but luckily she never noticed the egg or him. As it flew past him, it began to shrink, turning into a small black dot, which Wu Sun looked at with fear until the last. The dragoness seemed to have disappeared and he could finally relax, but no, his attention was immediately drawn to the pink egg sticking out of the bushes. However, as for the person who received the dragon egg, he didn't look too happy about it. He started shouting after the dragoness, irritated, asking why she didn't take her baby with her and if she didn't need it. But as expected, his shouting had no effect. Wiping the sweat from his forehead, he said that it was probably the first time she was becoming a mother, but even that didn't explain her neglect of her egg. Retracting his thorns on the vines to avoid damaging the egg, the protagonist reached for it. However, the distance was too great for him to reach. Fortunately, his yellow gecko friend soon appeared, casually returning from somewhere with a bowl in his hands. As he came closer, he looked at the protagonist in bewilderment, then turned his gaze to the egg. Seeing the free labor force, the protagonist turned to the gecko who was still not understanding what was going on and told him to try to push the egg to him. With zeal, he began to push it. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't even get it to budge. Finally, he was exhausted. This time our yellow Sisyphus couldn't even move his stone. Realizing that this would not do, Wu Sun called him over and began to show him something with his vines and explain the principle of leverage. But since the gecko would hardly understand, he told him to just do what he said. Following our flower's exact instructions, he found a large stone and placed it beside the egg, and immediately set to work. Finding a stout stick and using it as leverage, he gritted his teeth and began to push it with all his might, while the protagonist, acting as moral support, encouraged him as best he could. As a result of their joint efforts, the gecko not without sacrifice, in the form of a bruise on his forehead, but still managed to move the egg. The egg bounced a little in the air and rolled straight towards Wu Sun, who happily noted that it was a success. As soon as it got close enough, his vines immediately wrapped around it. However, no matter how he tried to lift it, he was not strong enough to do so, nor could he absorb it due to its enormous size. Even his big mouth wasn't big enough. The option of smashing it was also immediately declined, because if it spilled on the ground, it would hardly be edible. Clutching his head, he irritably wondered what he should do with it, since he had nothing to help him devour it at the moment. However, his musings were interrupted by the sound of something crackling. For a moment it puzzled him, making him wonder what it could be. After a moment, however, when he looked at the egg and saw the crack in it, it was clear. A dragon was hatching from it. In the main character's head immediately appeared the image of a small, cute pink baby dragon, which in his opinion was about to be born into the world. In the next instant, the shell on top completely cracked, and a bright golden glow illuminated everything around him. However, to the bewilderment and surprise of the protagonist, not at all what he had imagined hatched out of the egg. A small, chubby girl with horns on her head appeared in front. Wu Sun was stunned, because the fact that the egg would hatch into an almost ordinary girl, he clearly did not expect. In addition, she was immediately born in clothes. Looking at the weeping creature in front of him, he told himself that he should not be surprised, since he himself had turned from a boy into a flower. He looked more closely at the little girl, who had stopped crying, and noted that she had the horns and tail of a dragon, while her body looked human. Comparing these facts, he concluded that it was most likely a dragon girl. Suddenly the little dragon girl grabbed the eggshell with her chubby little hands, and began to chew it with her sharp little teeth. Seeing this, the protagonist in a panic wanted to stop her, saying that she should not eat the eggshell, but when he thought about it, he stopped. As a human, he had read many fantasy novels in which he had heard that as soon as a dragon hatches from its shell, it immediately eats it. Comparing the fact that he could have been in one of those fantasy worlds, which there was a lot of evidence for, he decided to leave everything as it was. By this time, the little one had eaten all the shells that were around, and was now looking at the last one she was sitting on. Making the incomprehensible sounds inherent in all newborns, she took hold of the shell with her hands. Then, panting, she began to try with all her might to pull it out from under her. As a result of which she succeeded in doing so, but at the same time she lost her balance and fell on her back. Seeing this, Wu Sun said with a disdainful look that this kid must be pretty dumb. Losing sight of the last piece of eggshell, the little dragoness began to look around. And the first thing she noticed was our flower, which noticed her gaze too and tensed up. The baby dragoness immediately and happily crawled over to him, calling him Mom. Wu Sun was very shocked at what he heard, and began to nervously glance at the gecko, asking if he heard her call him Mom. However, after he calmed down a bit, he thought about the possible reasons for her behavior. He remembered that he'd once heard that birds recognize the first creature they see after hatching from an egg as their mother, but he'd never thought that applied to dragons as well. And besides, what kind of mom could he be? He's a young guy after all. But that fact, along with the prickles, didn't seem to bother the baby dragoness at all, who immediately rushed at him with hugs and joyful cries of "Mommy, Mommy." She was so insistent and heavy that the poor flower was barely holding onto the ground with its roots and trying to prove to her with reasoned arguments that she had it all mixed up and he was not her mother. Its stem was cracking from the strain and the roots were beginning to pull out of the ground. But the little dragoness did not stop and continued to call him Mommy and piled all her weight on him. The poor flower began to think that she was doing it on purpose and was going to tear him out with the root, and began to beg her tearfully to stop and let him go. And surprisingly, she let him go. Wu Sun exhaled a sigh of relief, but continued to lament that he was about to fall apart. Out of all this, the good news was that the little dragon girl seemed to understand his words. But that didn't mean she'd had enough cuddling, and she'd already spotted her next victim, a gecko, who, when he saw the look in her eyes, knew he was in trouble. Now it looked like he was going to be a plush toy for the little girl in addition to his job as a bug hunter and water carrier. But judging from her cries, she had mistaken him for her daddy, and now Wu Sun was not happy about what was happening. So he indignantly told her that she had gotten it all mixed up, and he was the father here, not the mother, and this gecko is here as the pet dog, not the father. The little baby dragon girl looked at him carefully, but still continued to clutch the poor gecko. But it seems she understood what he told her as she set the frightened gecko on the ground, only to grab him again and hug him again, calling him doggy. The poor thing didn't seem at all happy about the role, and his look said it clearly instead of saying it. Wu Sun was glad that she understood him, and now realized who the gecko was. Calling her a smart girl, he asked who she thought he was now. But she didn't answer. Instead, she let go of the tortured gecko and stared at him intently. Then she showed him in no uncertain terms that she was hungry and wanted to eat. Wu Sun was not thrilled with the idea of sharing food. However, no one asked his opinion, and immediately after she spotted a dry leaf with bugs on it, she began to carelessly eat them without paying attention to the indignant cries of the disgruntled flower. In just a few moments she ate every last beetle, leaving behind only a dry leaf. And it seems that now, after a good meal, she wanted to sleep. Wu Sun didn't mind if she slept anywhere, but she surprised him and crawled right over to him, laying down near his roots. She immediately fell asleep carefree like a real baby. Watching such cuteness together with the gecko, Even the constantly disgruntled flower could not say anything against it. And she slept like that until the next morning, when the rays of the rising sun woke her up. Immediately after the baby dragoness woke up, she began to cry shrilly, demanding to be fed as soon as possible. She was hungry beyond belief. Wu Sun immediately began to calm her down and tell her to be quiet and stop crying because now he would send their dog for food. Our flower turned to his faithful dog with a very important task, to find as many beetles as he could as quickly as he could. Gecko already had a leaf in his paws and was ready for such an important mission. As he ran off to hunt, Wu Sun tried his best to calm the little girl, assuring her that their faithful dog would soon return with plenty of food. But the little one still wouldn't calm down. Now he realized how hard it was to be a nanny, and how the constant crying gave him a headache. At last, the gecko returned from his hunt with a pile of bugs. The baby immediately began eating them, quite enjoying the process, while the also hungry flower and gecko could only swallow drool. Wu Sun even asked her not to finish all of them and leave at least one bug for Daddy. But as it turned out, those bugs weren't even enough for her, and as soon as they ran out, she cried again, demanding more. Wu Sun didn't understand how she could be so brazen, eat everything, leave everyone else hungry, and then demand more. Now the poor gecko had no choice but to go hunting again, while our little flower was left alone with a crying little girl. He realized that he was afraid of her appetite, just in case she decided to eat salad after a meal of bugs. After a while, the gecko returned again with a bunch of various bugs. Wu Sun had already lost a good amount of weight, and now took one beetle with trembling leaves and was about to eat it. The haggard gecko did the same, as he received nothing for his efforts. But looking among themselves, they realized that if they ate them, the little one would definitely not have enough. They couldn't even afford to eat, no matter what they deserved. They agreed that it was the fate of parents to take care of their little girl and give her everything. However, their tired and exhausted faces disagreed with them. Watching her eat one bug after another, Wu Sun was at a loss as to whether she was a dragon or a bird or something in between. He wondered how fast she could grow on a diet of bugs. He realized with horror that as she grew she would eat more and more. The poor gecko would be tired to death running around looking for bugs, and him being chained to one place couldn't help him in any way. Something had to be done. And surprisingly, it was the gecko who came up with an idea to solve their food problem. He suggested a big toad fishing game where he would be the bait. Wu Sun didn't want to agree to this at first, because it was too dangerous, and he didn't want to lose his dog. But the gecko persistently convinced him that everything would be fine as long as he had some thorny seeds with him to help him. Taking a few thorns with him, he confidently went hunting, ignoring the flower's warnings to be careful and not to show off. Wu Sun looked at the bug-eating little girl and thought about what a difficult task it was to raise a child. Now he finally understood the hard work of his mother who raised him by herself. Her dishes was always the most delicious in the world for him. After a while the gecko returned, and not by himself. He barely escaped from his pursuers. Our flower was surprised that he came back so soon. And he brought not a toad, but aggressive and dangerous wasps. A whole swarm of wasps that buzzed frighteningly in pursuit of the intruder. It turned out that the gecko had figured out an ingenious way to get a bunch of food quickly, and threw barbs into the wasp's nest, causing them to chase after him. He was lucky that he was able to get to his defender in time, otherwise his skin would have been like a sieve. Now it was Wu Sun's turn to show the wasps what his improved barbed whips could do. The wasps seemed to be serious and rushed to attack without delay. However, Wu Sun had already prepared a surprise for them, and met them with a hail of spiky kang-ers. Days of practice had not gone to waste, and now he could hit one wasp after another with enviable accuracy. The wasps fell to the ground, and there was already a heap of them. But this did not stop the wasps, and despite the death of their fellow wasps, they rushed forward. Gradually, Wu Sun ran out of all the barbed ammunition that he had been accumulating for weeks. This was not a big deal as it was not his main weapon, but merely his first line of defense. He had already prepared his spiky whips for the wasps coming closer. And when the wasps flew closer, he released his spikes with all his fury, making a kebab of all the remaining wasps at once. After a couple more minutes of battle, the last wasps were defeated, and Wu Sun could now breathe a sigh of relief. It was finally over, and a large pile of dead wasps had formed in front of him, which should be enough for the baby dragoness for the time being. The gecko and the baby dragoness came out of their hiding place, happy that they had such a strong and reliable guardian. The baby dragoness ran to him, shouting happily that her daddy is the best. They stared questioningly at the battlefield littered with wasp corpses. Seeing their indecision, Wu Sun advised them to collect the wasps and its thorny seeds. He was sure that these wasps would be enough for the little one for a few days. Gecko went to collect first, and the little one wanted to help him too. After a while, they were able to collect a large pile of wasps, and even Wu Sun couldn't stop marveling at how many wasps there were. At last, they could eat as much as they wanted. and now the role of a father didn't seem so difficult for him anymore. The bonus to all of this was the many chests Wu Sun received, and surprisingly, even Ruhua didn't seem so ugly anymore. Though why am I lying, he's actually hopelessly ugly as always. After a while, seeing the little girl eating bugs non-stop, Wu Sun thought that having their daughter grow up eating bugs all day long wasn't normal. They should have gotten some meat and fed her properly. Gecko was of the same opinion. In order to get meat, they applied their already mastered style of hunting with the use of live bait. A few hours later, the gecko found their future lunch. This lunch was pretty big and hangry itself, so it immediately started chasing Gecko and trying to get him with its tongue. The unsuspecting toad stalked the gecko, catching up to him with its leaps. But he skillfully played the role of the victim and gradually led it into the trap. And when the toad was about to catch up with him, he suddenly turned to it and shot it with an imaginary gun. The toad, who was already hoping to swallow such an impudent gecko, did not even notice the green lightning bolts that were approaching it. It didn't even have time to squawk when the barbed whips bounded in a dead grip, and with one swift sweep of another whip, Wu Sun ended her suffering and black toad blood splattered in all directions, and her dead body hung helplessly among the thorns. With a few quick movements of the whips, the toad carcass fell to the ground with a thud. Wu Sun was happy that he had defeated the toad so easily, and now they would have a meat for dinner instead of the bugs. The new suffocating power of his whips also delighted him, as it would allow him to defeat opponents more serious than toads and snakes. They wasted no further time and immediately began to cut and slice the carcass. Little Yellow especially distinguished himself by the speed of his movements. Toad fillets flew in all directions. The little dragoness devoured it all with an enviable appetite. Piece after piece disappeared into her, and Wu Sun began to think that he would never be able to feed her enough. Days passed, and every day the gecko brought him new victims, which he killed with his whips. The opponents were different, sometimes toads, sometimes snakes. But every time to bring them, the gecko walked on thin ice and risked his life. It was enough for him to make one mistake and everything would be over for him. This fact bothered our hero very much, and he did not want this to continue. In addition, the little girl was growing very fast, and in a month reached the size of a 5-year-old child. With her restless appetite, these small animals were no longer enough to fill her stomach. Finishing another toad, Wu Sun thought that he should find a way to catch larger animals, but their size should be such that he could overpower them. It was not an easy task for him to solve, and he had an idea. When the gecko stared at him questioningly, not understanding what he was doing, instead of putting the toad on the ground to cut it up, he picked it up and started to carry it somewhere. Wu Sun explained to him that he wanted to use the toad carcass to attract bigger prey. Finally, Toad fell from his merciless whips and took its breath away. And indeed, a few hours later, its corpse attracted the attention of a new member of the local fauna, who, smelling the smell of blood and dead flesh, could not miss such an opportunity. It was a black rat who was tempted by dreams of fried toad and could not resist to taste it. Unsuspecting, the rat sank its teeth into the corpse, and even started to pull it away into the bushes. But suddenly, thanks to its instincts, it sensed the danger and trembled with tension, trying to pull its teeth out of the unfortunate toad. However, it was too late, and the barbed whips were already closing in on the rat that had taken the bait. When it was finally able to free its teeth and jump aside, it still wasn't enough to save it. The flower's spiky whips had it securely entangled, cutting off any possible escape attempts. The rat tried to bite the vine and tear it with its clawed paws, but despite its best efforts, it failed. And Wu Sun was able to easily lift it into the air, where the rat gave a shrill squeak. But that squeak was the last of its life, as revenge for daring to bite the vine caught up with it instantly, and he slammed it to the ground several times with force, kicking up dust. And now they had two carcasses at once, and the gecko didn't even have to risk his own hide for them. They were having a celebration. Wu Sun even thought that today he would definitely be able to feed his little daughter properly. As it turned out, their joy was premature, and a sound from the sky caught their attention, scaring them. An eagle was flying straight at them with its wings spread wide. Before they could react, it had grabbed the rat. They were shocked and just followed its movement with a glance. When Wu Sun came to his senses, it was too late and he could only shout curses at the insolent thief. There was no limit to his outrage. How dare this overgrown chicken steal his food? He would definitely take revenge on this. Wu Sun couldn't contain his anger, and he wasn't going to forgive this insolent overgrown chicken for stealing his prey. He shouted at the flying eagle to come back, damn it, simultaneously trying to hit it with barbs, hurling them one after another. His spiky ammunition raced toward its target at lightning speed. It seemed as if the villain was about to receive a just punishment, and his chicken ass would be slapped. But the eagle was too high and only mockingly looked at his pathetic attempts and spikes, which simply did not reach him. He was quite pleased with himself. Taking the prey from another weakling was a very successful move for him. Besides, what could these pathetic ground creatures without wings do to him? This only made Wu Sun angrier, but he couldn't do anything about it. He had already realized that the eagle was too high, but his powerlessness only made him more annoyed. But what happened next surprised our hero even more, and the eagle was pushed to the background. The little dragoness, having seen the example of her so-called daddy, decided to copy him. She too started waving her arms angrily and shouting, "Bad eagle!" Wu Sun looked at her pathetic attempts and advised her to stop because the eagle had already flown away, and she was only shaking the air in vain. But she was a naughty little girl, and not at all ordinary, so she managed to surprise her daddy. She continued to run screaming what a bad rascal that eagle was, and at the same time she began to glow with a bright golden light. It seemed like an epic transformation was about to begin. And so it did. That little ball of fury began its transformation into something more intimidating than a cute little dragon girl. In a moment, she was transformed into a true white dragon who, although small in size, was determined to chase down that eagle who dared to steal their food. Our flower and gecko's jaw dropped from such a transformation because they simply could not believe that in front of them was a real dragon. And she looked just like the dragon that had killed those two strangers. Now Wu Sun was beginning to worry about his own skin. The newly minted dragon had already accelerated and pushed from the ground. However, instead of flying majestically, something was wrong. The dragoness could not control its wings and tail properly and could barely stay in the air. Covered in sweat, she was shivering, and there was only one outcome to her convulsive movements. The dragoness finally realized with horror that she would not fly so long, and a kiss with the ground was waiting for her. And so it happened. As she accelerated after her flight, she landed painfully back on the ground, plowing the ground with her face. It turned out that even such rare and majestic creatures as dragons need training and practice, and even they can't fly into the sky just like that. Watching all this, our flower and gecko didn't know how to react. Now their clearing was like a battlefield, and dust was rising from it in all directions. Wu Sun, however, realized that it was because it was her first time flying, and that she lacked basic skills and would definitely learn everything in future. A crater was formed at the site of the fall, in the middle of which a bright golden flash had already reappeared, and Wu Sun asked the gecko to go and see if their little girl had been injured in the fall. However, the gecko had no sooner moved than the sound of crying filled their clearing. The little girl was crying as hard as she could and was already on her way to daddy. All the simple dreams of the poor girl had been shattered, and now she had to be calmed down immediately. Because now the little girl was running around the clearing with screams and crying, complaining to her daddy how much it hurts her. Our flower didn't even know what to do and how to calm his little girl, as he had no experience in such matters. Finally, he came to his senses and began to calm his daughter, asking her to stop crying and promising that he would help her to punish that nasty eagle, but all in due time, and she will have to wait a little. But she still did not calm down and continued to cry. Finally, deciding that calming her down was useless, Wu Sun decided to find out what kind of dragon she was. And remembering her appearance after her transformation, he assumed that she was similar to Ying Lun from the classic of mountains and seas. Looking at her, he realized that she would grow up very quickly, so he needed to give her a name soon, because he couldn't call her his daughter all the time, and always refer to her that way. He had to think of a suitable name for her, and based on her dragon-like appearance, he decided to call her Yin Yun. Now that she had a name, it was worth focusing on more important things. Remembering how birds train their chicks to fly and show them their own example, he wondered what he should do with his little girl. And while little Yin Yun can't fly properly, she needs to train. But the question was how to help her, because he himself is just an ugly flower with a bad temper and a big mouth. Hell, he can't even move. How can he teach her how to fly if he can't show her anything? But first, he decided to ask her if she liked her new name Yin Yun. To do so, he started from afar and solemnly announced to his daughter that she had grown up, and it was time for her to have her own name. Then he asked her what she thought about daddy calling her Yin Yun. She liked that name and it sounded great. Then she finally calmed down and went back to her dragon form to try again. And our flower finally figured out how to show her what to do too. To demonstrate, he came up with the idea of using his vines, weaving them together in such a way to show Yin Yun what she was required to do. Dragoness was at first frightened by this demonstration, fearing that daddy had decided to spank his naughty daughter. But as it turned out, he waved only to show that from today he is ready to help daughter to train and learn to fly. Today he decided to show her how to flap her wings and stay stable in flight. To do this, he asked her to come closer and stand on the so-called hand of her daddy. She obeyed and clumsily climbed onto his hand, trembling from exertion and effort. Our flower was amused by such an attempt, but he kept instructing her to work her wings more actively while flying and to try again right away. Yin Yun obeyed, and literally after a few flaps, she soared into the sky quite swiftly. At first glance, it seemed that now she would definitely succeed, but it only seemed. Because in the air, the little one was not so good, and her too convulsive and detached movements were too clumsy for a long flight. Our flower cheered her up as best he could, and advised her to keep trying her best, and not to be afraid to look and fly forward. A painfully familiar memory of his mother teaching him how to ride a bicycle floated before Wu Sun's eyes. Now it was clear to him exactly what it reminded him of teaching a dragon to fly. Back then, his mom had advised him to keep his bike steady, keep his balance, and not be afraid to move forward. Now he understood the hard work his mother had done, and how he wished he had been grateful enough to her for it all. But unfortunately, there was nothing he could do. There was no turning back. He was brought out of his memories by the whistling sound of the dragon starting to fall. He shouted to her to be careful and hold on, but it was too late. The speed she had gained in the steep peak left her no chance to regain her balance, and with every second she was getting closer to the ground. Luckily, she was not that high up, and quite quickly her aerial journey ended in the nearest bushes where she fell with a thud. Wu Sun, worried for her life, immediately started shouting, asking Yin Yun if she was okay. The gecko didn't stand still either and ran to the crash site with all his legs. All of them were so worried that the child they cared so much about wouldn't get hurt from such a hard fall. Finally, the bushes moved, but they moved as if there was some kind of struggle. Our flower continued to desperately ask her daughter Yin Yun what was going on, and how was she? But there was no answer. Finally, the bushes quieted down, and Yin Yun came out of them holding a snake in her teeth. She rather boasted to her daddy to see what kind of snake she had caught. All bruised and scratched but very happy, she went back to our flower, who kept asking if she was hurt or bitten by that poisonous snake. But Yin Yun reassured him and told him not to worry, because she had done everything just as he had taught her, and had bitten the snake herself so that it could not do anything. Now Wu Sun was just shining with joy. At last his little girl had grown up enough to hunt snakes on her own, and now he and the gecko could breathe a sigh of relief and not worry so much about how to feed her. This was the best news for him today, because he would finally be able to rest as he had dreamed. After a few days, Yin Yun had gotten completely used to her dragon form and had learned to fly properly without landing on her face. And now she was constantly flying above Wu Sun, as if guarding his peace. Our flower watched her rapturously, marveling at how easily and effortlessly she flew now. Every day she was getting better and better at it. And now he even began to envy her, because he himself had no wings, and he would like to fly as freely, easily, and effortlessly as she did. The gecko also looked at all this with his mouth wide open, not hiding his admiration. Seeing that she was getting too far away from them, Wu Sun had already started waving for her to go back and not fly so far away. But she didn't pay any attention to him, and he thought that now that she had the vast expanse of the sky in front of her, she didn't care about the pathetic bugs like them on the ground. It seemed like that was the case, because soon Yin Yun disappeared from their sight, and only the blue sky with clouds was left above them. Now they had no words to express their disappointment at how they had been shamelessly abandoned. How dare she just fly off into the distance and not even thank them for everything? After 5 minutes, they finally came out of their daze, and Wu Sun awkwardly asked the gecko if he thought that she had flown to find her birth mother and now abandoned them forever. All he got in response was silence and the howling of the wind. And so another 20 minutes passed in silence, and our flower was only more convinced that his guesses were correct, since she still has not returned. He thought how quickly she'd grown up and left him. I guess parents feel the same way when their kids leave and go off to college. When he was almost completely desperate, a winged silhouette suddenly appeared in the sky in the distance. When they saw it, they glowed with happiness, and it was their little girl Yin Yun who had decided to return. But looking closer, all their joy faded away and was replaced by fear and tension. It wasn't their little girl at all, but that damn eagle. Our flower did not understand why he came back. There was nothing to steal. Did he really want to chew on the roots? But it was not like that. It seemed that the eagle was in a panic and was running away from someone. And the reason was right behind him and gradually approaching him. It was Yin Yun, who was very serious and had actually flown specifically to find this eagle and pluck its feathers. Seeing her return, Wu Sun glowed with happiness and said that he had always known that little Yin Yun would never leave her old father alone. He also marveled at how vindictive she was, that she went looking for trouble with that eagle no matter what. Daddy's girl, well done. Taking advantage of the fact that the eagle was heading towards him, our hero was able to successfully make several accurate shots. The eagle was hit and stunned. Losing its feathers, it involuntarily began to fall to the ground. Wu Sun marveled at how clever his daughter was, for she had deliberately sent the brazen eagle towards them. It was not an easy opponent, so teamwork was necessary. Although the enemy was hit, it was not enough, because he had already had time to come to his senses and continue to run away. However, our hero did not plan to just let him go. In addition, he was eager to try out and practice a new skill. In the next instant, dozens of spiky seeds soared into the sky and headed towards the eagle at a great speed. Although our hero was not a sniper in his past life, but it seems that his skills were successfully trained. After all, it was very difficult to explain his accuracy in any other way. Once again receiving a hit for his crimes, the eagle screamed in pain. But as it turned out a moment later, the thorns were not the only, and not the worst of his problem. There was hardly anything scarier than a dragon's big clawed paw about to grab you by the head. Already in the next moment happened what seemed to be to end the eagle forever. Our little girl had successfully managed to grab him. But as it turned out, everything was not so simple, and the eagle turned out to be even more unpredictable opponent than they expected. Even as he fought the dragon, he wasn't about to give up. In the next instant, he bit Yin Yun's finger with its strong beak. Our little girl wasn't prepared for this. After all, she was just a small child. When she felt the pain, she immediately cried out painfully and let go of the bird. The eagle was surprised that his resistance had worked. Before he could recover from the shock, he began to fall to the ground, losing his feathers. In any other case, he would probably have recovered in time to take off. But this time everything was much more difficult, because at the bottom of the eagle was waiting for the barbed whips of our hero, which immediately rushed straight to him. Although our little girl did not manage to completely defeat the eagle, there was no point in worrying about it. After all, Daddy was there to solve his daughter's problems. The eagle, who at some point already believed in his salvation, at the sight of barbed whips, realized that he was a fool. After all, there was nothing scarier than an angry father. In the next instant, Wu Sun was already shouting fiercely that it was for daring to peck his daughter, stamping the eagle into the ground. From the force with which he hit it, and the explosion that occurred, it was safe to say that our hero was indeed very angry. As soon as the dust from the impact began to settle, our hero saw the eagle lying motionless on the ground, which appeared to be dead. Since victory was theirs, Yin Yun rushed towards our flower with a bright smile. She was very happy that she was also able to contribute, and happily declared that she already can and knew how to hunt. Wu Sun himself was very proud and happy for his daughter. Patting her head, he said that she had really grown up and could hunt on her own. Receiving her daddy's praise, the little girl happily purred with pleasure. Since they had managed to defeat a difficult enemy, Wu Sun decided to celebrate. Hearing this, the gecko and the little dragoness were very happy, as it was the first time they were going to taste poultry meat, and it surely would be very delicious. Time flew by, and a whole month had passed since the eagle hunt. Every time he looked at how much and what kind of prey Yin Yun brought, Wu Sun could not help but be convinced that his daughter had grown a lot. She was now looks like a 10-year-old child, but as it turned out, she liked her dragon appearance better. In addition, now she went hunting every day, so the gecko no longer had to risk his life and be the bait. Bringing in her prey once again, the little girl proudly reported on her progress. Not holding back on the praise, the gecko and Wu Sun immediately praised her wholeheartedly. This praise was not unfounded, for the little one had really managed to accomplish a lot during this time. Her flying and hunting skills had greatly improved. And it was thanks to this that they were now able to eat nutritious meat every day, and not have to worry about having to eat nasty bugs. They finally received meat freedom. As Wu Sun handed Yin Yun another piece of meat, she worriedly asked why he didn't eat it himself. Our hero replied that this piece for her, and she shouldn't worry about it, as he was already full. He realized that his little girl continues to grow day by day, and in the near future it will not be enough for her to eat only frogs, snakes, and birds that she hunts now. So now he tried to do everything on his part to make her stronger. But soon, he didn't need to worry about it anymore. Yin Yun herself began to feel that this meat was clearly not enough for her, so she soon began to hunt bigger prey. The first big catch was a large lynx, which his little dragoness didn't leave a chance for survival. Seeing such a large prey, Wu Sun was shocked and couldn't believe at first that she had managed to catch a real lynx. Realizing what a strong opponent his daughter was facing, our hero began to ask excitedly if she was hurt. Yin Yun proudly replied that he shouldn't worry about her, as she was already very strong and could take care of herself. But the surprises for Wu Sun didn't end there. For the next time, Yin Yun brought a hyena. Our hero was so surprised that he stared at her prey in silence for a few seconds with his eyes wide open. When he came to his senses, he immediately shouted to Yin Yun, saying that he had already told her not to catch such a large prey. In addition, hyenas were particularly dangerous. They lived in groups and were also very cunning. But what worried our hero even more was whether his little girl had any wounds. When she landed on the ground, the little dragoness told him not to worry about her, as she remembered everything he had taught her. She added that she had followed his teachings and attacked the hyena when it was alone. However, as soon as she came closer, our hero immediately noticed a bleeding claw wound on her leg. Like a real caring father, he immediately told her to come over so he could examine the wound. Examining the wound, he asked about what had happened. Yin Yun immediately began to reassure her caring daddy. She replied that it was just a small scratch she got when she was hunting. The hyena reacted too quickly and managed to bite her. After listening to her, Wu Sun replied that it isn't minor injury, and wound is still bleeding. Although Yin Yun was a dragon, she was still very young and inexperienced. Therefore, our flower couldn't help but feel worried. Besides, when hunting large prey, she didn't always manage to kill it with a single strike. She had to grab it and throw it down from a height. This was a risk because the prey, even when clawed, could fight back and hurt her very badly. He immediately remembered how he himself had come home as a child with scratches from falls, and every time his mom was treated his wounds and told him to be careful. But he was a kid at the time, and he wanted to do what everyone else was doing and jump from the flower beds. His mom understood that, so instead of banning him from playing completely, she decided to teach him how to land properly. So that he could minimize the damage from the fall, she taught him that he should bend his legs, keep his body's center of gravity downward, and imagine himself as a spring when landing. Also, he should try to be flexible and supple. To which Wu Sun happily and enthusiastically replied that he got it and would follow this advice. Now looking at the wound on his daughter's leg, he saw that it had already stopped bleeding and was beginning to heal. When he saw this, he was once again convinced that she was worthy of the title of mythical beast because she had the same strong healing properties. However, even that couldn't completely guarantee her safety, and so he definitely needed to teach her some methods of hunting and defense so that in difficult moments she could protect herself, just like his mother had taught him as a child. But the problem was that he didn't know how he could teach Yin Yun how to hunt. After all, he wasn't a flying dragon and couldn't show her how to hunt, and he didn't know how to hunt like a real adult dragon. At that moment, our hero realized that being a father was really hard task. However, even in the most difficult moments, our genius flower always found a way out, and this time was no exception, because soon a great idea came into his head. Even though Wu Sun didn't know how the dragons hunted here, he was an immigrant from another world, and he knew one thing. The safest way to launch an airstrike is to drop bombs and launch projectiles. The very next moment, he set about implementing his plan to train his little girl. Turning to the perplexed Yin Yun, he told her to bring a large rock with which she could fly freely. Gecko, on the other hand, he ordered to draw a large enough cross on the ground. Armed with the broken bone, the gecko successfully completed his task. Everything was ready for training. As soon as he finished, Wu Sun immediately shouted to him to run away, which he did in a hurry. A moment later, the majestic silhouette of a dragon appeared in the sky. After finding the right stone, Yin Yun returned back. Wu Sun immediately started giving her instructions on what to do. He explained that she had to aim first, then swoop down on the mark and throw the stone at it. Although it was not an easy task, Yin Yun had no choice. After all, in order to hunt safely, she needed these skills. Therefore, after concentrating and aiming, she released the stone. Once in the air, it flew towards the ground, and hit the ground with a loud rumble. However, as expected, she failed to hit the cross for the first time. It was not surprising, as such precision required a lot of training. But unlike her daughter who thought it was a failure, Wu Sun was delighted and proud of her achievement, because even though it was her first throw, she almost hit the target. She was training much faster than he was, and the title of Lizard Outliner Master would definitely stay with him. But she couldn't stop there. So our hero said she should keep practicing. And first, she'd have to learn how to hit fixed targets, and then move on to moving targets. And when she can hit every target without a problem, she'll be considered a godly pitcher. Half a month later, a pack of hyenas snoozed peacefully in the desert landscape, unsuspecting of anything. And they were dozing for a reason. The nibbled remains of a carcass nearby told that they had had a big meal not long ago. One of the hyenas was yawning sweetly, and life suited it just fine, until the moment everything changed. And a whistling sound from above made the hyena raise its head up, its instincts telling it that it was in danger. But when it saw the boulder flying directly at it, the hyena was stunned and didn't understand what was happening or what to do. It is not every day that hyenas are hit in the head by boulders, and its reaction was expected. In a moment, the hyena was finished and only blood spattered from under the stone. The rest of the pack of hyenas immediately ran away raising dust. The unlucky one who had been hit on the head with a stone finally lost his spirit. His carcass was immediately grabbed by large white claws and dragged upwards. It was little Yin Yun, who had grown a lot in the past half a month. Children always grow fast, but dragons were much faster. Right now, she was happy with how she had done. How epic she had crushed that hyena with a rock, all thanks to her daddy who had advised her on such a really effective hunting method. Using this stealthy attack method, Yin Yun didn't have to worry about scaring the hyena pack early, and she could catch the hyena that she liked without worrying of being bitten. As she was heading back to her daddy with her prey, something on the ground caught her attention, and she wondered what it was. Just beneath her lay the scattered remains of two skeletons and their humble belongings that the wild beasts were not interested in, unlike their flesh. Amidst all of this, a sword with a golden hilt stood out in particular. Yin Yun herself didn't quite understand what it was, but its shiny appearance did not leave her indifferent. As we all know, dragons love golden trinkets. Looking closer, she assumed it must be a human weapon, a sword her daddy had once told her about. She also remembered that her daddy was always playing with that broken arrow, and he would surely love it if she brought him something like that sword. So putting all her doubts aside, she decided to pick it up and give it to her daddy to make him happy. Swooping down, she grabbed the sword and flew home. Carrying the sword and the hyena carcass at the same time was not an easy task, but she managed, and the carcass fell not somewhere in the field, but right next to our flower, who immediately appreciated her good work. A direct hit to the head, instantly fatal. The once little Yin Yun was now truly a godlike pitcher. This was especially impressive to the gecko, who couldn't wait to taste the hyena. Finally, the gigantic Yin Yun figure itself landed not far away, and once again Wu Sun couldn't stop marveling at how fast the little dragoness was growing. In less than 3 months, she had already become so big. And not just in dragon form, but in a human-like form as well. Enveloped in a golden glow, she began to transform into a young girl already. The light was bright and nothing could be seen. A glance at the form of this light was enough for our flower to make his eyes widen with embarrassment, but he was unable to look away. Moreover, in her human form, she had already become a tall, beautiful, and sexy young lady, the appearance of which left no one in this clearing and not only indifferent. It was hard to describe how harmoniously the features of a draconic and a human girl were combined in her. She was simply perfect. And as soon as the transformation was complete, she immediately rushed to her beloved daddy with a hug, shouting happily, "Daddy, I'm back!" As she hugged and shook her so-called daddy, she kept repeating how effective the hunting method he had taught her had been. In her opinion, she had the best daddy in the world. But the flower, still embarrassed by what she had seen, was not so happy about such a strong embrace. And in his usual disgruntled and grumpy tone, he asked her to be careful, because if she didn't stop, Daddy's old waist was about to break. Despite his shouting, he was quite pleased with her behavior, because if you think about it, it's not so bad when a beautiful girl hugs you like that. Come to think of it, he had never been so close to a girl before. Suddenly this whole train of thought was interrupted when he realized that it wasn't right at all. Why was he suddenly thinking this way? She's his so-called daughter. As soon as he came to his senses, he freed himself from her embrace, and furiously began to explain to his daughter that she had already become a young lady, and now she couldn't hug her daddy like she was used to before. Yin Yun herself didn't understand what had happened and what she had done wrong, so she asked why she couldn't hug her beloved daddy. He himself was not an expert in this matter, as well as in most other matters that concerned fatherhood, but still he tried to explain to her that when daughters grow up, they avoid their fathers just as sons when they grow up avoid their mothers in certain cases and circumstances. Hearing this, she of course didn't understand anything, and with eyes full of tears asked Daddy why he was suddenly so furious if Yin Yun herself hadn't done anything wrong. Now Wu Sun had to awkwardly ask his little girl not to cry. After all, he didn't mean to be cruel, and he doesn't take offense at her. She should just remember Daddy's words and not do it again from now on. The sword that Yin Yun had brought, which had been in the bushes all this time, came in handy to defuse the situation and change the subject. Now Wu Sun grabbed this opportunity and asked his daughter what gift she had brought for her daddy. Yin Yun immediately cheered up and proudly announced that she had brought a big sword and she had hidden the sword in the bushes to surprise Daddy. The only thing she was wondering now was whether Daddy would like the sword. Our flower was not stupid and assured her that he'll like it, as long as it's a gift from his sweetie. He knew well that the main thing in gifts is not the gifts themselves, but the attention and the person who gives them. But this time, the gift exceeded his expectations. It wasn't just some trinket. When Wu Sun tried to pull the sword out of the ground with his vines, it was quite heavy. That didn't stop our hero, though, and he put in a lot of effort to see what kind of sword it was. He finally succeeded and raised the sword above him, looking it over and recognizing that it looked good. The sword was shaking and looked like it was about to fall, so the dragoness and especially the gecko tried to keep a safe distance. Wu Sun took a closer look at the sword and realized that it belonged to those two men who had come to the clearing a few months ago and had fallen victim to the dragoness from whom they had stolen the egg. That meant that there might be something else useful in that place. So our flower asked Yin Yun where she found the sword. And wasn't there anything else there? It seemed to him that those adventurers must have had a bunch of useful things with them. Yin Yun, recalling what she had seen, replied that there were two human skeletons at the foot of the mountain and a sword lying right in the middle of them. Besides the sword, there was also a small shovel, two backpacks, and a dagger. At the end, she wondered if Daddy wanted her to bring him all those things. After thinking about it, Wu Sun decided that he only wanted the shovel and the dagger, and he didn't need the rest of the junk. Yin Yun was happy to help and promised to bring everything tomorrow after the hunt. In all of this, only one thing gloomed the beautiful sunny day for our hero. Those two skeletons were probably the ones who stole the egg from the dragoness, and he himself had a hand in killing them. The thought that because of him, living people had died did not give him any peace. But watching Yin Yun running merrily through the clearing with the gecko, he came to the conclusion that he had no other choice, as the danger threatened not only himself, but also his so-called daughter. Who knows what those people planned to do with the egg after they stole it? Yin Yun was probably in danger. She could be eaten or let her hatch and then enslaved. Any of the possible outcomes was sad for her, so all of his actions were right. People just didn't leave him any other option. And if he could choose again, he would still take them out without regrets. However, he still had to decide what to do with the sword that was too heavy for him and kept falling out of his vines. Our flower was getting tired after just a few swings of this heavy sword, and this was even though he was using two vines at once to hold it and swing it. Last time, even a simple operation like pulling a man's leg had barely worked for him, with his vines snapping at the seams and nearly tearing. Now he just needed to make his vine stronger, so that he could swing it without any problems using only one vine. Deciding that the best solution would be to practice, he went about his training, trying to raise his sword again. Meanwhile, Yin Yun and the gecko were already enjoying their lunch and didn't understand why our flower didn't eat with them. Was he not hungry? But Wu Sun assured them that he would eat later, because now Daddy needed some more training. After a few days of training, he was ready to show what he could do, and saying cheers. He quickly swung his sword, which he could now safely hold with a single vine. In one motion, another hyena brought by Yin Yun was decapitated. Now hyena-sized creatures were no longer scary to him even without Yin Yun. The sword was a significant advantage in a fight with any opponent. Wu Sun had a whole cheerleader squad, including two cheerleaders, Yin Yun and Gecko. They were marveling at how he cut the hyena into two pieces with one swing. How incredible and powerful he is. All thanks to his training and several improvements and evolutions, with which he could now easily swing this sword with each of his four vines. Further slicing the hyena into smaller pieces, he invited everyone to come for it was time to eat properly. Daddy was cooking. Wu Sun decided that it was cool to use the sword as a kitchen knife, but it was even better to hide it in the bushes and use it as an ace up his sleeve in case of an emergency. If some humans or other large animals show up nearby and decide it's a good idea to pick the odd flower, he can catch them off guard and slay them. Thanks to a heavy diet of hyenas and other smaller local fauna, our hero was able to accumulate 5 mystical chests, each requiring 10000 evolution points to open, as Ruhua kept reminding him. Judging by his appearance, the way he congratulated our hero on receiving the chests looked not sincere, but Wu Sun had long ago stopped paying attention to this ugly system spirit and continued to quietly enjoy the meal. It was only when they had all eaten that he decided to open a few boxes, but he didn't want to choose one himself and entrusted the choice of one chest to Gecko and the other to Yin Yun. It was time to test their luck and knowledge of arithmetic. Each of them had to choose one number from 1 to 5 and tell about their choice. Watching the behavior of our flower Yin Yun kept wondering why every time after meals Daddy always plays arithmetic games with them, after which he is either delighted or upset and argues with the air. In short, he behaved as strangely as possible, even for a flower with a bad temper. But it didn't matter to her. As long as her daddy was happy, she was willing to play his weird games. This time she chose the number 5, and the gecko chose 2. Then at the command of our flower, Ruhua opened the chests numbered 2 and 5. What will Wu Sun drop out today? A useful improvement or another piece of junk? In the next instant, Ruhua solemnly announced the opening of the 5th chest. A bright golden light poured from it as usual. The system immediately congratulated our hero for obtaining a B-class plant gene. As it turned out, it was the same gene he already had. The system immediately detected this and offered 2 options to improve the gene he already had. The first option was to improve the strength and power of the thorns he threw out, while the second option gave him the ability to increase their number. After all, At the moment, he could only use a limited amount per day. Although it wasn't a particularly difficult choice, Wu Sun couldn't help but ponder. In the end, he still came to the conclusion that the best solution was to increase the strength of Kang Air. He immediately informed the system spirit of his decision, to which the system spirit enthusiastically said that it would fuse. A moment later, our hero shone with a bright light, which meant that the fusion was successful. The system window reappeared in front of our hero, but there was no new information for him. So he told Ruhua to open the next chest. Unlike the last chest, this time Wu Sun had a new gene called the grape plant gene, which was a C-class gene. It was a grapevine, which was one of the oldest fruit tree species in the world, and was known for its nutritional value. However, it was not this information that interested our hero. When he saw the information that the fusion was to take place with a portion of the fruit, he wondered what it could mean. Ruhua immediately explained that it meant that he would be able to blossom and bear fruit. After the fusion, he would be able to spend a certain number of evolution points to grow grapefruit. Hearing that he would also have to spend points, Wu Sun became even more dejected. However, the system spirit had great news. He said that the fruit not only had a great flavor, but also had the effects of healing, blood recovery, and enhancing the related buffs. In addition, he could not only eat it himself, but also share it with others. This information pleased our hero very much. After all, now he could not only take care of himself, but also heal his fellows. He immediately shouted enthusiastically to Ruhua to start the fusion. A moment later, he had a new gene in his arsenal, which, according to the information in the system window, allowed him to produce a clean bunch of grapes at a low cost. Not only was it full of nutrients, but it also increased blood regeneration by 15%. The note said that if it was dried and made into raisins, it could be used to brew a bottle of 1982 Lafite. Although the prospect of creating alcohol was quite tempting, Wu Sun focused on solving more pressing problems, namely the one of how he was to utilize his new skill. Fortunately, as always, he was helped by the system spirit, which despite being ugly and annoying, was quite useful. He explained that it was similar to how he stockpiled food in his roots. Then he just had to mentally visualize that he wanted to bloom and bear fruit. Following his advice, our hero tried to concentrate and imagine that he wanted to blossom and bear fruit. In the next moment, a system window appeared in front of our hero, informing him that the price for a bunch of grapes would be 5,000 evolution points. Wu Sun was horrified by such a huge price, and even considered not doing so. However, his system spirit immediately began to convince him that it was worth it. For now, grapes were available to him, but he would surely have more options in the future. Besides, the price of 5,000 points wasn't that much if it could save someone's life. With this, our hero couldn't help but agree. Having finally made up his mind, Wu Sun applied the skill. The very next moment, he found that his vine leaves began to grow. A short while later, his vines began to bloom. Everything was happening so fast that our hero didn't even have time to notice how green bunches of grapes appeared, which almost immediately turned into bunches of juicy and ripe grapes. Yin Yun and Gecko were really amazed at how quickly everything happened. Wu Sun was more pleased than surprised, because if he could save up enough evolution points, he could open a winery. However, there was a disadvantage, because the bunches were so heavy that it was difficult for him to even lift his head. However, this problem did not compare to the possible benefits of the grapes, and since our hero finally managed to grow it, it was time to try what he got. After all, it was necessary to decide whether he should continue to do it. As it turned out, it tasted pretty good, so he immediately offered it to Yin Yun and Gecko. As expected, they also liked the flavor very much. You could tell from their faces that they could keep eating it forever. But our hero was not only concerned about the taste, but also about the promised effects. So he immediately asked the gecko and daughter if they felt anything special after eating the grapes. However, as it turned out, other than the great taste, they didn't notice anything. Hearing this, Wu Sun speculated that the lack of any effects was possibly because they had no injuries. Under normal circumstances, however, it was just an ordinary fruit that only differed from the ordinary fruit by its great cost. Our hero, on the other hand, was comforted by the thought that he would be able to grow other fruits in the future once he obtained the right genes. But as soon as Wu Sun imagined that a huge durian fruit would grow on his head, he thought about the safety of his life. However, he decided to save those thoughts for later, because he wouldn't be able to grow a durian now anyway. Besides, by the time he could, he would most likely be much stronger already. After a while, Yin Yun returned home from another hunt, bringing 2 hyenas with her. Praising her for her big catch, our hero noted that today she had done much faster than usual. But as it turned out a moment later, there was a reason for that. The dragoness in a panic told that on the way back, she saw 5 people on the other side of the mountain. This was not good news for our hero, because after what happened, he had no desire to encounter people in this world. At least now. He hoped to the last that his daughter was just mistaken, because she had never seen people before. However, there was no mistake. Since Wu Sun often told Yin Yun about humans, she knew that only they could pitch tents and bury the two discovered skeletons. The situation was getting worse. After all, these people were most likely not just ordinary travelers, but friends of the past too. And since their friends had been killed, they were clearly determined to find those responsible. Our hero immediately asked Yin Yun if the people had discovered her. In response, she shook her head negatively and said that she was flying very high. This was good news, however. There was still danger. Therefore, Wu Sun immediately told his daughter not to go hunting on this side of the mountain in the future. After all, if she was spotted and hunted down, it wouldn't end well. Although Yin Yun didn't fully understand the danger that people could pose, she obediently replied that she would do so. Our hero realized that they would most likely encounter humans sooner or later, so he immediately cut up the meat and called the gecko and his daughter to eat. After all, they would obviously need strength to stand up to the humans. This time, he was determined to have a good meal himself. While everyone was looking at him in bewilderment and trying to figure out what had caused such a disturbance, Wu Sun ordered Ruhua to open all the chests he had. Ruhua complied with his request. However, nothing but doubled points fell out of the chests. This made our hero quite angry, but he couldn't do anything about it. So he ordered the system spirit to set aside 50,000 points and spend the rest on strengthening his leaves, stems, and vines. The enemy was going to reappear sooner or later, and by then he had to have gotten stronger by any means necessary. He had been lucky last time. This time, however, he must have the strength to protect not only himself, but also those he cared about. A few days had passed since then. A large shadow swept over the ground at a great speed. It was Yin Yun, who was scouring the surroundings for prey as usual. However, there was a problem with that lately, as there were no more prey left in this area. And on the other side of the mountain, she couldn't hunt due to her father's prohibition. But as it turned out, even this neighborhood was no longer safe. For even now, there was someone watching her from the ground. It was two men who were watching the dragon flying in the sky from the bushes. Realizing that it was still quite young, they were already beginning to imagine how much money they would receive. All they had to do was wait for the young and inexperienced dragon to fly closer. A moment later, the arrow shot through the air and into the sky. After reaching its target, it stabbed into the wing of the unsuspecting Yin Yun, who let out a painful cry at the same moment. Even though she was a dragon, even an arrow could still cause her very serious damage. Fortunately, she didn't get confused like when she fought with the eagle, and didn't fall to the ground. Her eyes immediately started looking for the offenders. When she saw the group of armed men, she was puzzled, as she couldn't understand how they had gotten here. However, she had no time to think, because the next moment several more arrows flew at her. This time Yin Yun was ready. She immediately soared upwards, leaving no chance for the shooters to succeed. Ignoring the pain in her wing, Yin Yun immediately decided that she had to report everything to her daddy. Watching the dragon fly away, the man with the crossbow in his hands laughed. Since he had managed to wound its wing, it was clear that it wouldn't be able to fly far. The others also agreed with him. After all they had to do now was to follow the dragon to the south. The bald man with a beard, who was probably in charge of all these bastards, ordered the two guys to prepare a dragon cannon. After all, even a young dragon was still a dragon, and anything could be expected from it. Soon, Yin Yun managed to return to home clearing, where our hero was already waiting for her. Noticing that her wing had been pierced by an arrow, he immediately began to panic and ask about what had happened to her and who had injured her. Yin Yun sadly replied that it was humans and that they were already here. Our hero couldn't immediately understand what was going on and how the humans were able to find them. He immediately asked Yin Yun if she hadn't listened to him and hunted near the human camp. She replied that she hadn't. She panicked and explained that she was suddenly attacked by 3 people who were hiding in the bushes. Hearing this, Wu Sun could not contain his anger. He was very angry at the bastards who dared to touch his little girl. Asking Yin Yun to be patient for a while, he started to pull out the arrow from her wing. Even though it was painful, it was definitely necessary before he could treat the wound. Having accomplished this task, our hero began to grow a bunch of grapes. In just a few moments, in front of him appeared ripe and juicy grapes. That soon flew straight into the dragoness's mouth. A moment later, the healing process began. Wu Sun was surprised to see such a fast regeneration, as the dragon's regeneration together with the effect of the grapes literally performed miracles, and our dragoness's wing was restored in a matter of seconds. Seeing that everything was successful, our hero asked his daughter how she was feeling. She was still a little worried though, and replied that she was no longer in pain. While Wu Sun was taking care of and treating Yin Yun, He completely forgot about their main problem, which was people. The next moment, a gecko rushed over in a hurry and panicked to report that 3 people were heading towards them. Such a rapid development of events took our heroes by surprise. Although they realized that sooner or later people would find them, they could not think that it would happen so quickly. The gecko's words were true. In a few moments, several silhouettes appeared on the horizon, and they were approaching them quickly. On the face of our hero, there was horror. He realized that they probably couldn't avoid a fight, but he decided to try. He ordered Yin Yun and the gecko to run away and hide in the bushes. He could only hope that they wouldn't be noticed. Yin Yun and Gecko began to reluctantly run away. They didn't want to leave Wu Sun behind, but they had no other choice. All they had to do was hope that their daddy could think of something. Soon, 3 poachers did indeed appear. They moved rather cautiously and looked around carefully for a downed dragon. Their bald-headed leader was surprised that such a young dragon had managed to fly so far with such an injury. At the same time, Wu Sun was watching them from behind the bushes. Although he had the goal of hiding and not attracting attention, it wasn't that easy for him. After all, he could hardly restrain himself from pouncing and slashing these bastards. Suddenly, the fatty excitedly noted that there were many different rare plants in this area. While he was shaking his head in different directions, what our hero feared happened. Looking at Wu Sun, the big guy told the others that he had found some strange plant that he had never seen before. Our hero's disguise was finally revealed. The gazes of all the men were directed straight at him. In their minds, he looked strange, and even a little disgusting. However, their leader was of a different opinion, because he knew that the stranger the plant looked, the more expensive it was. Wu Sun listened to their conversation with an annoyed look. Although he was just a simple, ugly flower with a big mouth, even he had pride. But making fun of his appearance wasn't his biggest problem right now. For suddenly one of the poachers noticed a trace of blood near him. He immediately realized that it was most likely the blood of a wounded dragon. However, he was very surprised that the traces ended here. At that moment, our hero realized that he had made a huge mistake. After all, he had completely focused on treating the wounds and Yin Yun, and had completely forgotten about dealing with the bloodstains. But now it was too late to do anything about it. The bald bandit immediately came to the conclusion that this plant most likely had a significant regenerative effect and could treat even serious wounds. Plants with this effect were very rare, so he immediately went to our hero, intending to dig it up and study it well. The guy with the crossbow wasn't interested in the flower, so he didn't stop the fat man. All he was thinking about was the possibility of catching the dragon. At the same time, the shovel was getting closer and closer to Wu Sun's roots. However, at that moment, our hero was more worried about Yin Yun than himself. He realized that if she saw this, she would probably not obey his order and rush over to save him. Indeed, that's what happened. In the next instant, someone started shouting at the bandits to stop. It was Yin Yun. With furious shouts, she began to quickly approach the bewildered poachers. Wu Sun's worst assumptions had actually happened. Upon seeing our dragoness, the bandit leader became perplexed. He didn't understand where the girl could have come from. However, as soon as she came closer and covered the flower, everything became clear. She was no ordinary girl at all. Dragon horns, tail, clawed hands. The poachers immediately realized that the transformed dragon was indeed standing in front of them. It was a turn of events that suited the bastards just fine. After all, dragons that could transform were very rare. Besides, she was still very young, which meant that she could definitely become a strong riding pet. Perhaps some would say that dragons were the most evil and scary creatures. However, this is far from true. After all, the scariest creatures are humans who are ruled by money and selfishness. At that moment, Yin Yun was truly convinced of the truth of her father's words. Without wasting a second, the poachers immediately rushed towards her. The little girl still hadn't recovered yet. The stares the bandits were giving her really scared her. It seemed to be the end. Heroes always show up at the last moment. That's what happened this time. At the last moment, spiky vines blocked the way for the bastards. They scratched and stabbed their hands. The fatty immediately cried out in sharp pain. He didn't even realize where the thorns had suddenly appeared from. Taking advantage of his confusion, Wu Sun shouted to his frightened daughter to quickly run away. Yin Yun didn't want to leave her daddy alone and wanted to object. However, our hero was firm in his decision and was even willing to sacrifice himself to save her. He immediately shouted for her to leave, adding that he himself will deal with the bandits. He had really grown up. Not daring to disobey her father again, Yin Yun immediately transformed into a dragon. Seeing that their money could fly away from them at any moment, the fatty immediately began to panic, shouting to his friend to do something about it. Unlike him, he was completely calm. He was confident in his skills and knew that such a young dragon would not be able to escape from him. In the next instant, he fired with a smirk on his face. Luckily for our little girl, the arrow didn't hit her. After his first miss, the bandit did not despair and continued shooting. He had plenty of arrows, which meant he had many more attempts. None of this would have mattered to Yin Yun if she had just flown away. However, she didn't. Soon, the fatty noticed this as well. He couldn't help but wonder why she didn't fly away, but only continued to dodge. Their leader already had an idea about it. His gaze immediately shifted to our hero. After comparing everything he saw, he concluded that the dragoness was protecting the strange plant. Besides, he had heard stories before that some precious spirit plants were protected by beast protectors. His hand immediately went towards Wu Sun without hesitation. As soon as the fatty heard their leader's words that it could be a spirit plant, his eyes immediately shone. He couldn't believe that they could get a spirit plant that was worth almost the same amount of money in addition to the dragon. In the next instant, the old man's strong hand grasped the stem of our hero. Wu Sun immediately experienced intense pain. However, this was not the worst part, for the old man's plan was something else entirely. Turning to Yin Yun, he gave her a choice with a caustic smile. Either she would come down to them, or her father would die. However, Yin Yun didn't need much time to think about it. With furious screams, she immediately rushed to save her daddy. The old bandit watched her approach with a wry smile. In his eyes, she was just a dumb dragoness that had fallen into his trap. He ordered the guy with the crossbow to take his time and wait for her to get closer. They needed the dragon alive, so he needed to shoot the wings and by no means kill her. However, Crossbowman didn't need to be reminded of that. In his mind, he was as focused and restrained as possible. At that moment, it seemed to the bandits that success was in front of them, and that nothing could stop them anymore. But to their misfortune, Wu Sun didn't think so. Those bastards wounded Yin Yun. After that, they hunted them down and tried to kill them. They tried to lure his daughter out by blackmailing her with his life. They really went too far. Even though he was just a flower now, he was determined to fight. Now that the bandits had gone beyond all boundaries, he wasn't going to hold back. Brutality for brutality. At the same time, Yin Yun continued to approach them at breakneck speed. The fire in her eyes made it clear that she was very angry. But it wasn't that simple. After flying close enough, she was within range of the crossbow and became an easy target. Crossbowman was sure he wouldn't miss. The next moment, however, things didn't go according to plan. Suddenly, his arms were wrapped around a strong, spiky vine. The guy was perplexed. He did not understand where they came from and how he could not have noticed them before. But now it was not important to him, because the biggest problem was that the vines began to prevent him from moving. At first they only hindered his movements, but after a while it was as if they had become intelligent and began to guide his movements. At some point the poachers didn't go according to plan. Looking at the arrow aimed at him, the old man tried to understand how everything had turned out so badly. The guy holding the crossbow couldn't resist the vines that were stronger than he was. But this was far from the end. It was just the beginning of the show. A performance of punishment and revenge on the bastards. The trigger had been activated, and not at all by the bandit's will. Yet there was nothing he could do. All he could do was shout in horror to the old man to dodge. But it was too late. There was no chance that human instincts would be enough to dodge a speeding arrow. Judging by the look of horror on the old man's face, he realized it himself. What happened was what was supposed to happen. The released arrow pierced through the old man's chest. However, the bandits never realized who was the real culprit of all this. The guy with the crossbow couldn't believe what had happened. Before his eyes, his leader had fallen dead to the ground, and the worst part was that it seemed to be his fault. Seeing what had happened, the fat man began to swing his sword and angrily asked what he was doing. But the guy himself would have wanted to know how it happened. All he felt was two vines grabbing his hands, and then the irreparable happened. But even that was far from over. And so, shaking with fear, the bandit realized to his horror that something else was approaching him. With horror on his face, he turned around. It was the same vicious vines that had caused him to kill the leader. Once he wouldn't have given them any thought, but now the mere sight of them terrified him. The fat man who was watching this was also frightened. Although he had seen many different and unusual plants, this was the first time he had seen a living vine. But the one who had a real problem was his friend. After all, the spiky vines of our hero had already managed to reach his neck. More and more vines began to appear from the ground, which bound the guy more and more tightly. Unable to resist such a force, he fell to the ground exhaustedly. While he was screaming and writhing in pain, Wu Sun said in a cold voice that although he couldn't throw him off the ground as Yin Yun would, he could still strangle him without any problem. The guy's skin went goosebumps. Adding to the fear was the fact that he didn't realize who the owner of the voice was. Suddenly, a broken arrow appeared in front of him. Wu Sun intended to let him experience his own weapon. He asked the guy if he recognized this broken arrow. However, it was useless for him to ask such questions. All his thoughts were filled with fear, and all he thought about was who that terrifying voice belonged to. Without waiting for an answer from the mad bandit, our hero shouted in a furious voice that it was the arrow he had shot at his daughter's wing, and which was still stained with her blood. At that moment, Wu Sun's heart was filled with rage. He was like a demon. The very next moment, the same arrow had already stabbed into the guy's stomach. It finally returned to its true owner, who for some reason he wasn't quite happy about it. Following this came the heartbreaking scream of the bandit, but our hero did not pay attention to it. He dared to harm his daughter, so there was no forgiveness for him. Soon it was all over. The lifeless body of the guy was left lying on the ground. But it was only over for one bandit. For the other, it was just beginning. The fat man who'd been watching the whole time had a look of horror on his face. He couldn't believe that their perfect plan had been ruined because of some plant. It seemed to him that he was facing a devil that could devour him at any moment. The idea of digging up a strange flower didn't seem good to him anymore. He found it hard to believe that a flower could do that, but his dead accomplices were good proof of it. But the next moment something even stranger happened. Suddenly the flower turned to him furiously. He called him a fatty and asked why he wasn't avenging his friends. That was the last straw for him. He couldn't understand anything else. It was as if everything around him was just an illusion. Yes, it's definitely an illusion, was the conclusion the fat man came to in the course of his thoughts. To be more precise, he simply couldn't explain it any other way. Deciding that killing the flower would rid him of his illusions, he rushed at our hero in despair. In his opinion, it was the easiest way out. But a moment later, when his sword met with resistance, the fat man realized that this was not the case. He stared at the sword in bewilderment, trying to understand where it had come from. He never would have thought that a flower could be capable of using it. It made him even more certain that it was just an illusion. He swung at Wu Sun with even more fury, intending to end it all here and now. However, his plans were not destined to come to reality. Grabbing the bandit by the shoulders, Yin Yun angrily told him to stay away from her daddy. Here she is, daddy's little girl. In the very next instant, the two of them were already surging into the air. The fatty shouted in fear and anger while Wu Sun wished them a good flight. It was said that after that, the fat man was never seen again. However, there were still witnesses who saw Yin Yun and the bandit take to the air. It was the two men who had been sent by their leader to get the cannon. When they saw the dragon start to take their friend somewhere, they panicked. They didn't know what had happened or why the fatty was in this position. But it didn't matter to them now, because now they had a great opportunity to kill the dragon. Even though the fatty wasn't a priority, they could save him if they hit the dragon. Without a moment's hesitation, the bandit lit the fuse. No miracle happened, the fire didn't go out. A moment later, a loud shot rang out, and a large metal cannonball at great speed headed straight to our little dragoness. Dragons have very well developed intuition. Therefore Yin Yun immediately sensed that something dangerous was approaching. When she saw the fiery ball approaching her, the little dragoness froze in surprise. She had never seen anything like this before. Fatty, on the other hand, understood the situation very well. Even though they didn't use the cannon often, he had a very good understanding of what would happen to him if he gets hit by such a projectile. Wu Sun understood this as well. He wasn't interested in what would happen to the fat guy. All he was worried about was his daughter's condition. Even though she was a dragon, even she might not survive. He immediately panicked and started yelling to her to run away immediately. After coming to her senses and realizing the danger, Yin Yun decided to run away. Since the fat man was too heavy and prevented her from moving quickly, she immediately released him. Once he was in a weightless state, he began to scream in panic. However, it didn't last long, because a moment later, the cannonball shut his mouth. A tremendous explosion lit up the sky. It was so strong that Wu Sun couldn't tell if his daughter had escaped or not. A moment later, something flew out of the cloud of smoke and began to fall to the ground. From the silhouette, our hero immediately recognized Yin Yun. He immediately imagined the worst-case scenario and started to panic. The bandits also saw that the dragon was defeated and fell to the ground. They didn't care about the fatty at all, as they had already achieved their goal. They justified themselves by saying that he would have died anyway. They immediately rushed to find the dragon's body. They had originally planned to catch it alive. However, this option also suited them, because even a dead body was worth a lot of money. But as it turned out, our little girl was still alive. Even though she was injured and had a very ragged look, it was not that important. Wu Sun as well as Gecko were very happy that Yin Yun had managed to survive. Now it was important for them to take care of her health. While the gecko was helping the little girl, our hero began to grow medicinal grapes. It was needed now more than ever. Once everything was ready, Wu Sun threw a single bunch into Yin Yun's mouth. This was supposed to help her recover quickly. The wounds on her body began to heal little by little, but it wasn't enough. Our hero didn't have many evolution points left, and they were only enough for one bunch. Another and the biggest problem was the people who were still alive and who could come here at any moment. The last bunch should have been enough for Yin Yun to be able to fly. Therefore, Wu Sun immediately ordered her to fly as far away as possible. The little dragoness didn't agree with this decision completely. After all, she wasn't going to leave her daddy alone. Seeing her worry, Wu Sun replied that she had nothing to worry about. He is just a plant, and would not attract the attention of the hunters who only wanted a dragon. But this time, Yin Yun didn't believe his words. She remembered that he had said the same thing the other time, and the bandits ended up capturing him anyway. Now she knew how horrible and greedy people could be. Their conversation went on for a while, but they never settled on anything. At the same time, remaining 2 poachers appeared on the horizon. Although our heroes realized their mistake, but it was too late to change anything. They were caught in the act. Seeing the scene that appeared before them, the men were horrified. It was very hard for them to believe what they saw. The bloody bodies of their comrades lay on the ground in front of them. All of them were dead. Behind them on the ground was a dragoness. The bandits immediately thought that he was the one who had done it. Since the dragoness stayed on the ground for some reason and didn't fly away, they thought it was because it was seriously wounded. The dragoness was still alive, which meant they still had a chance to catch her alive. Though it could be a lot more dangerous, but in their opinion, it might be worth it. Seeing that one of the bandits had pulled out an object that looked like a weapon, Wu Sun immediately ordered Yin Yun to fly away. She didn't want to leave him, but he was relentless. With tears in her eyes, she still agreed, and a moment later, she flew up into the air. The poachers immediately panicked, for they had never thought that the dragon would recover so quickly and run away. But even in this case, they had a plan. Taking out a rifle, the bandit aimed at Yin Yun. He wasn't going to miss this opportunity, and so in the next instant, a shot rang out. What flew out from the barrel of the rifle was no ordinary bullet. It was a special metal net, which was used to catch powerful creatures like dragons alive. Yin Yun sensed the approaching danger, but it was too late. The metal net completely covered her, giving her no chance to do anything. A moment later, she fell to the ground with a clatter. Although the situation was critical, but Wu Sun didn't panic. He had a plan, and so he ordered Yin Yun to try and crawl towards him. At the same time, the poachers were rushing towards them with snide faces. In their opinion, it was already over, and now they would become rich. Our hero at the same time began to try to cut the net with his sword. But no matter how hard he tried, the metal mesh would not budge. The situation seemed to be hopeless, because the bandits were almost there. But they didn't really have to worry. Everything was not hopeless at all, and the gecko lurking behind a rock in ambush was proof of that. Holding a sharpened stick in his hands, he resolutely signaled to our hero that he is ready. A villainous smile appeared on Wu Sun's face. Everything was ready, and they only had to wait for their victim to fall into their trap. Turning to Yin Yun, he told her to keep calm. He also added that she should now transform into human form in order to get out from under the net. The bandits, on the other hand, rushed forward full of confidence. They didn't even realize that they were no longer hunters. They were prey. A bone spike pierced the man's foot along with his boot. Having accomplished his treacherous mission, our little yellow ninja hurried away to avoid being smashed. The poachers didn't even bother to look under their feet, which was their critical mistake, for which they paid painfully. Now the poor guy could only hold on to his injured leg and scream, while his partner didn't understand what was going on and how that guy could be so inattentive. While they were distracted, Wu Sun had an opportunity to help his daughter, but with his thorns instead of hands, he was afraid of hurting her, so he didn't dare to take the net off her. He only advised her to transform into her human form and take the chance. During her transformation, a wave of energy appeared, which simply threw the net off her. It was the first time the poachers had seen such a trick and didn't understand what had happened. Looking at the empty net lying aside, they didn't understand where the dragoness they had already caught had gone. The prey that already seemed to be in their hands was gone. But only to suddenly attack these failed hunters from above. The dragoness was gone, but a girl appeared, a very angry and bloodthirsty girl. While still in flight, Yin Yun turned back into a dragon. And now she was going to kill those annoying people. The poacher himself didn't understand since when dragons turned into girls and back again. But he didn't have to guess for long. With her powerful paws, Yin Yun threw the poacher to the ground, leaving him no chance to escape. She was very close to biting off his head, but he managed to dodge and she only clenched her teeth. The poor guy desperately begged his partner to save him, and he didn't leave him in trouble. A poacher with a large two-handed sword swung well and was about to chop off Yin Yun's head. He was close, very close to success. but at the last moment his sword was stopped by another sword. An expression of horror froze on the poacher's face. He didn't understand how. How could this poor flower could wield a sword so skillfully? Wu Sun accomplished his mission and distracted one poacher, giving Yin Yun a chance to deal with the other one. She decided to use a proven method that her real mother had already used. Grabbing the roaring poacher tighter, she began to lift him higher and higher into the sky. And his companion too could not resist his opponent, who simply did not leave him no chance. Our flower even had time to mock his opponent and deliver one blow after another. His vines were too flexible and fast and simply left the man with only two hands no chance. Eventually, one of Wu Sun's blows reached its target, and the blood of his opponent sprinkled the clearing. The wounded poacher would certainly no longer be a threat. The poor man was now shivering in pain and could barely stand on his feet. However, it turned out that he was more surprised not by the fact that he was wounded, but by the fact that this damned flower could talk. The guy didn't seem to have a high level of intelligence because he had made the wrong conclusions and overestimated his strength, especially when he was going to tear that flower demon to pieces. The poacher rushed forward to deliver his strongest blow, but Wu Sun had no problem repelling it and even managed to resent that he wasn't a demon, but an ordinary guy who had been reborn into a flower. Where the poacher lacked strength, he decided to use cunning, and after another unsuccessful attack with a sword prepared a dagger behind his back. He immediately threw it at the flower with a cry of "Die, monster!" Wu Sun was a bit unprepared for this turn of events, and said unhappily that his opponent had no goddamn military ethics if he dared to make such a mean sneak attack. Still, our flower had no problem repelling the dagger with his other sword. And now his look was quite intimidating to the terrified poacher who had already realized that he was dead. Not only this flower had a sword, but now he had two. The poor guy was about to run away, wetting his pants. Especially when Wu Sun gently hinted that he had 4 vines instead of 2. He shouldn't have underestimated the plants. Having frightened and puzzled his enemy properly, our flower decided that it was time to finish and took out of the bushes his next tool, a crossbow. That's where the 2 spare vines came in handy. With a vicious smile, he pointed his trump card up at this terrified enemy. The guy was terrified and his eyes bulged, realizing that this was the end for him, because this damn flower surely could shoot as well as he could wield a sword. In the flower's opinion, those who dared to bomb Yin Yun had no right to live, and the shot from his crossbow was accurate. Deadly accurate. The poor guy didn't even have time to scream before his body fell to the ground in a dead weight. The arrow had hit him in the head, killing him instantly. The same fate befell the other poacher, who after a short flight in Yin Yun's clutches was now testing the laws of physics on his own skin, checking whether the acceleration of free fall is really 9.8 meters per second. Unfortunately, a resounding smack on the ground put an end to his short-lived research, and only a cloud of dust rose into the air. When it dissipated, it was clear that the poor guy had not suffered for long either, and had also died in peace as quickly as his comrade. Yin Yun immediately descended lower and started flying in circles around Wu Sun, congratulating her daddy on his victory. Gecko also ran out from his hiding place in the bushes to celebrate the victory. He kept shouting how powerful the boss and his daughter were. Wu Sun was also happy for the victory, but realized how close they were to defeat, and was having a hard time catching his breath after the battle. He would gladly not participate in such battles anymore. When everyone had calmed down, our flower suggested cleaning up the battlefield and all the corpses so that the smell of blood wouldn't attract any more trouble. Predators, humans, dragons, and anything else could come to the smell of blood. So the corpses definitely needed to be removed. The only remaining question was how. Yin Yun was the first to have a simple and effective idea. She suggested to just eat these bad guys. But Wu Sun was not at all enthusiastic about such an idea. Cannibalism was not in his plans. So he suggested that it would be better to throw these corpses away, and he explained that the meat of these bad guys tasted disgusting. This news was very sad for Yin Yun and the gecko. They wanted to eat the bad guys so badly, but Daddy had forbidden them for reasons they didn't understand. Suddenly looking around the clearing, Wu Sun was horrified by what he saw. There were 3 attackers, and there were only 2 bodies in the clearing right now, and the body of that crazy old man had disappeared, leaving behind only a puddle of blood and a lonely arrow. Now Wu Sun was as furious as always that things weren't going according to plan. The damn old man didn't want to die, and the arrow in his chest wasn't enough to finish him off. He took advantage of the fact that no one was paying attention to him and prepared his revenge. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but this was not the case. The old man had loaded the bombard and was already lighting the fuse, shouting for the monsters to go to hell. He was going to use the bombard to blow all those little rascals to pieces. Everything was happening too fast, and our flower barely had time to react. However, not much depended on the speed of his reaction anyway. He could not run away. Yet he was willing to sacrifice himself so that Yin Yun and the gecko could escape. There were only a few seconds left before the fuse would burn out. The daughter didn't want to leave her daddy, but he insisted, and she finally agreed. And putting the gecko on her head, she soared high into the sky, where the bombardment couldn't reach her. But the crazy old man didn't even try. His main target was the hated flower that nearly killed him. The cannonball fired from the bombardment was now flying straight at Wu Sun. He wasn't going to resign himself to fate so easily, and was going to fight even in this situation. In an attempt to stop the cannonball from flying at him, he threw the net in front of him that the bandits were trying to tie up Yin Yun with. But the cannonball didn't even feel any resistance and simply tore the net. Now all he could do was try to make the cannonball explode as far away from him as possible with his vines. To do this, he pointed all 4 vines towards the cannonball at once. Now the life or death of our flower was decided in the next few moments. The cannonball collided with the bundle of his thorny vines and exploded with a loud boom. His vines were immediately destroyed by fire and blast wave, which didn't stop there and reached the flower itself, sweeping it away with deadly flames. Yin Yun and the gecko watched in horror. Their beloved daddy was on the verge of death. Even more than that, it seemed that the roasted remains of the flower were no longer viable. Tears of grief came from Yin Yun, but they were quickly replaced by rage and a thirst for revenge. She knew very well who to aim it at. On that crazy old man who was now rejoicing that he had managed to kill at least one monster. Yin Yun swooped down on him from above with her open toothy mouth determined to tear him to pieces. The old man was immediately frightened and hurriedly ran away, hoping to find shelter in the shade of the trees from the aerial attacks. He was sure that as long as he ran through the forest, the dragoness would not be able to catch him there. Indeed, when he hid in the forest, Yin Yun couldn't see him, and it wouldn't be wise for her to make her way through the woods. But the dragoness was a smart girl who had learned well from her daddy, so she immediately noticed the bombard left behind and figured out how to use it. Or rather, how to use the remaining cannonballs. She didn't trifle and lifted a whole crate into the air. Yin Yun wasn't going to let her father's killer escape so easily. He had to pay. The evil old man soon got tired of running and hid under a big tree trying to catch his breath. He was sure that he would be safe until he himself came out of the forest. But he was wrong, for soon a whistling sound from above caught his attention, and he was horrified to see dozens of cannonballs flying from the sky straight at him. He was not prepared for such a turn of events and could not even imagine that such a thing was possible. Where did dragons know how to drop bombs? There was no point in running away from such a bombardment, and the old man's corpse, after a few explosions down below, went into space. And the forest itself had suffered a lot from the series of explosions that swept away everything in its path. But all of that was nothing compared to the loss of Yin Yun, and the revenge that had been taken could not fill the void left by the death of her beloved daddy. She returned to her human form and bent over his remains. Along with the gecko, she kept making futile pleas. "Wake up, Daddy! Wake up!" But nothing helped. It seemed that everything was over and there was no hope. And this wonderful world would never again hear the swearing and discontent of an ugly flower with a big mouth. Suddenly, the sweet potato roots of Wu Sun, which were deep underground, glowed with a strange green light. And the remains of the flower itself as well. This puzzled Yin Yun, who didn't understand what was going on. Meanwhile, the damaged stems, leaves, and even vines magically regenerated themselves. The burnt flower regained his normal color and came back to life, until he finally opened his eyes wide, and cheerfully declared how cool it was to be resurrected and brought back to life. Now the only thing he wanted to do was have a proper snack. Death was too close this time, but it was all avoided thanks to his supply of nutrients in his roots, which wouldn't be a bad thing to replenish now. Yin Yun and the gecko immediately began to hug our flower. They were so happy that he had come back to life that it was hard to describe in words. After a long hug, Yin Yun finally let go of Wu Sun, but immediately burst into tears because she thought she would never see her daddy again. And in all of this, she considered herself to be to blame since she was the one who had attracted these bad guys here. Our flower couldn't stand it when his beloved daughter cried, so he hurried to assure her that it was not her fault, and everything ended up fine in the end. Those guys were just bad adventure hunters who liked to run around looking for trouble, and they had found their clearing on their own, without Yin Yun's help. After calming his daughter down, he started to ask what was that explosion just now, and where did that old man run off to? Wu Sun, of course, didn't know what had happened while he was unconscious. Hearing about the old man, Yin Yun got angry again and said that she would never let him escape, so she blew him up with a bomb and more than one. Looking around, our flower saw the consequences of her actions. The forest was in ruins, and this masterpiece was the handiwork of his darling daughter. Ironically, the old man was killed by one of the bombs he brought with him. Hearing how his daughter dealt with the scoundrel, and seeing the consequences of her actions, our flower was simply delighted. He praised his daughter for being so clever to use cannonballs as bombs in an emergency. Although he felt a little sorry for the innocent trees and the environment that had been damaged, revenge was far more important. Now, one had to get busy cleaning up the battlefield and the corpses so they wouldn't attract predators. And they also needed to scout around to see if anyone had heard the sounds of explosions and wanted to check it out. They didn't need any more uninvited guests right now. Yin Yun readily agreed to do it. As she moved the corpses away, Wu Sun had a thought. When they had killed 2, it meant bringing in 5. Now that 5 were dead, they would definitely send an even bigger and better equipped squad to look for them. They had to get out of here soon. Otherwise, our little flower would never get a peaceful rest. The number of humans would only get bigger and bigger until one day he couldn't handle them, and he would be trampled and burned, and Yin Yun would be put in a cage or killed as well. If he could walk, they would all get far away from here together. As it is, he's stuck in the ground with no way to take a step. Wouldn't there be some way to move? If there was a suitable flower pot somewhere, then Yin Yun could carry him anywhere. Inspecting the battlefield, he stopped his gaze at the useless pile of scrap metal that the bombard had become after all the gunpowder and cannonballs ran out. If only there was a way to get our flower out of the ground and into a suitable container. Finally, an ingenious though obvious idea struck Wu Sun. Looking closely at the barrel of the bombard, he realized that it was shaped very much like one of the flower pots he had seen in his mother's greenhouse. All he had to do was work a little on the barrel of the cannon to make one, and it would be a flower pot just like it. In Wu Sun's opinion, the idea was brilliant. The main thing was to climb into the muzzle of the cannon and cover his roots with earth. And then Yin Yun could take him far away from here. There, in a new place, he would be able to find fertile soil with lush trees and a water source nearby. In such an ideal place, he would once again ask Yin Yun to transplant him into the open ground from the pot. However, there was one thing about this plan that he was a little embarrassed to remember. When he was still a boy and tried to transplant flowers or other plants himself, they always died because of his wrong actions, and his mother always scolded him afterwards. Now he wasn't sure he could transplant himself, and the stakes were too high to be wrong. He was very worried that something would fail, and his vulnerable roots would dry out or fail to take root in the new soil. While he was immersed in his thoughts and memories, Yin Yun had done all the work and successfully cleared the clearing and reported back to Daddy that she was back and everything was done. The bodies of the bad guys had been thrown far away from here, and now they were safe. But it was obvious that our flower wasn't in the mood, and Yin Yun couldn't understand why. They had just defeated 5 enemies together. They should be happy and celebrate, not sad. There was no point in keeping the hidden threat that appeared after defeating the 5 adventurers. So our flower tried to explain in all colors that humans would not ignore such an incident and would send more people to find out what happened to their comrades. Therefore, it wasn't safe to stay here now. Then the frightened Yin Yun asked what should they do. The solution was simple. They just needed to get far enough away from this place so that these people's comrades couldn't find them anymore. Hiding was a risky and unreliable option, so Wu Sun didn't even consider it. After Yin Yun heard his intentions, then she had a logical question. He is a plant that needs to be in the ground all the time. Where is he going to go, and most importantly, how? After all, he doesn't even have legs. But for our flower, the lack of legs was not a problem, and he had already thought of a plan of action. Yin Yun only needed to take the cannon off the wooden cart and bring it closer so that Wu Sun could work with it. The daughter obeyed Daddy, but she still didn't understand what the cannon had to do with Daddy's departure. She kept wondering what he needed it for. Her imagination was running wild, and she imagined that our little flower had gone mad and was going to climb into the cannon and shoot himself instead of the cannonball. Hoping to get far away unharmed, but even to her such an idea seemed very doubtful. When she voiced her assumptions, Wu Sun only laughed at her. Sure, he admitted that his head was a bit round, but not to the extent of acting as a cannonball. He assured her that she had misunderstood and that he needed the cannon for another purpose. But in order to understand what purpose she should try to separate the cannon from the wooden carriage. Yin Yun tried her best, but the cannon was very heavy and was firmly attached to the wood and would barely move from its place no matter which side she pushed it from. She was getting desperate and told Daddy that she couldn't do anything. But Wu Sun suggested she try a trick that was sure to separate the cannon from the carriage. All she had to do was to lift it all together into the air to a sufficient height and drop it down from there. The cannon itself was made of iron and would definitely not break, but the wooden carriage would surely shatter. Yin Yun obeyed and began to lift the cannon into the air. However, even so, it was very heavy. She clenched her teeth and pulled upwards, sweating as hard as ever. Finally, when there was no more strength left to hold the cannon, she let it go into free fall. As it hit the ground, the cannon's carriage shattered and only the barrel remained. It was already much lighter, and now Yin Yun easily pulled it closer to our flower and asked with interest what next. And now Wu Sun had a cunning plan to turn the muzzle of the cannon into a first-class flower pot. And for this purpose he had already prepared a whole arsenal of tools, which for success had to be stronger than the cannon itself. He began with manic persistence, like a monster with tentacles, to shred the cannon barrel so fast that only green sparks flew out. It was only a few minutes before the cannon barrel was shortened and dug into the ground. Wu Sun looked at the results of his work, and was confident that now that he had fixed the cannon barrel, it would not fall. This was the end of our flower's work part, and everything else was up to Yin Yun and the gecko. They absolutely did not understand what was going on, and asked for detailed instructions on what to do. Our flower began to explain that they need to carefully dig him out. He would do it himself, but he can't see his roots because of the leaves. But this idea seemed unfortunate to Yin Yun, who remembered well how our flower had resisted being dug out of the ground by bad people, and didn't understand how digging it up now would be any different from what it was then. How could her daddy come up with such a terrible idea? Had he had enough of living? Wu Sun sighed tiredly and asked, what does she mean he was tired of living? She misunderstood. He is still young and full of energy, and he still has his whole life ahead of him. In fact, he just wants to be put in a flower pot, with the right soil, constant watering, and fertilizer. And as long as those 3 points are followed, it will continue to grow and do well. Of course, in the open soil, more nutrients and space for the roots, but then the flower cannot be moved. And at this moment, mobility comes first. It finally came clear to Yin Yun that Daddy was going to plant himself in the cannon and thus be able to move around. Wu Sun praised Yin Yun and the gecko for their ingenuity and told them to get to work and start digging from both sides, being careful not to hit the roots. They were excited to get to work. Too excited, even suspiciously excited. And it soon became clear why. They were so enthusiastic about this work that the dust rose high above the clearing and only the glint of the shovels was visible. Wu Sun was horrified at how quickly and inaccurately they were digging, hitting his roots, chopping them, and pulling them too hard. He even started begging them to stop and leave him alone, but they paid no attention to his cries. Finally, the job was done, and our flower, leaning on its vines, began to climb out of the dug hole. Now all its roots and tubers were in full view, and looking at them, Gecko and Yin Yun marveled at how cool and amazing his roots were. But our flower didn't like it at all. He felt as if he was naked in the street and everyone was laughing at him and pointing fingers at him. So he irritably yelled at them to turn away and quickly fill the cannon barrel 2/3 full of soil so that he could finally plant it. They had no choice but to quickly turn away and agree to all the demands. They began to fill the soil into the cannon, but one important question came up. What does 2/3 mean? How much is that anyway? While they were trying to figure it out on their own, our flower was non-stop yelling at them and pushing them around. Finally, everything was ready, and Yin Yun carried a satisfied Wu Sun to his new home. He asked to just throw all his roots into the pot, and with everything else he would manage and arrange them so that he would be comfortable. Fortunately, all 3 tubers with nutrient reserves had been used up in the last battle, and his roots could easily fit inside the pot. Yin Yun lowered him into the pot, but something didn't go according to plan. They didn't figure out how much is 2/3 of the soil and only poured in a little bit, and when our flower was lowered into the pot, he fell to the bottom. Wu Sun immediately began to lament that they had poured so little soil that he felt as if he were imprisoned at the bottom of a well. When Yin Yun tried to get him out of the cannon, there was another problem. Our flower's head was too big, and there was no way she could get a grip on it. So he wailed that children can't be trusted with anything serious, and decided to get out on his own. With trembling vines he started his way to the sun, but the polished metal was slippery, and it was difficult to climb up it. But with 4 vines at once, nothing was impossible, so he was soon able to get out and asked Yin Yun to give him a hand. She helped him fix his position at the right height, and then asked him to hold on a little longer while she added more soil. Now the height of his placement was perfect, and all that was left was to add enough soil to fill the entire cannon barrel to the edge, which Yin Yun successfully did. Now our flower was successfully planted in his opinion, and was enjoying life. He could now be considered a true toothy bonsai. But something else was still missing, and he wondered, was planting flowers really that easy? Just filling with soil was too easy. That's when he remembered how his mother, when transplanting flowers, watered them afterwards and watered them plenty. That's what he was missing now. So he asked his daughter if she had thrown away the bad guys' equipment and backpacks when she was disposing of their corpses. Yin Yun replied that no, she had left everything here in the clearing, because he had once told her that human equipment could be used for their own good. That's why she left everything there. Wu Sun was delighted at what a thrifty, good, and diligent daughter he had. So he sent her off to find something that looked like a water bag, an object called a wineskin. These bad guys came from far away, so they must have it, and not just one. Yin Yug was an obedient girl and immediately went to look for it. Soon she returned with 2 leather wineskins. She was as happy as a child who couldn't wait to help Daddy. Wu Sun was also pleased with her findings, and asked her to hurry up and fill them with water from the nearby pond so that the soil in the pot could be watered as soon as possible and the roots could be filled with life-giving liquid. So he asked her to hurry up before her daddy withered without water. Yin Yun transformed into a dragon and set off. She moved so fast that only a cloud of dust was left behind her. Seeing her go for water, the gecko also wanted to help and brought his water leaf. But our flower had to disappoint him and talk him out of such a useless idea. With such a small leaf, as long as he brought enough water, our flower would definitely wither away. Soon, Yin Yun returned and the life-giving water poured into Wu Sun's pot, wetting his roots that were already starting to dry out. There was only one small problem, or rather a hole. The hole where the fuse was inserted, and our little flower was worried that such precious water wouldn't escape through it. But so far, according to the gecko's observations, all was well and dry. Soon those 2 tubs of water ran out, but the soil in the pot was still a little dry, so he had to ask Yin Yun to fly for more water. After a few minutes, the water flowed into his pot again, and at this moment, Wu Sun seemed to be the happiest flower in the world. This time, there was already enough water. Unfortunately, the bliss of our flower did not last long, because what he feared so much happened, and the poor gecko was forced to flee from the spray. We all know what that's like. And our flower knew exactly what it looked like from the outside, so he irritably shouted to stop staring at it and don't even dare to laugh. It's not what it looks like. And he's actually stopped wetting the bed since he was 6. Luckily, such an inconvenience quickly passed, and all the extra water poured out. This problem was replaced by another. Wu Sun felt as if he had moved from a huge mansion to a small room. He was very uncomfortable and was unable to fully spread his roots, which lacked space. He hoped that if he was patient for a few days, things would normalize and the discomfort would pass. Even if not, he could always ask Yin Yun to plant him back in the open ground. But the realization that the bad guy's friends could find them at any moment quickly made him accept all the discomfort and speed up all the preparations so that they could all escape from this place together as soon as possible. Unfortunately, the cart was broken. It was for the best, though, because with the cart, they wouldn't be able to take advantage of Yin Yun's flying skill. The best solution was to think of a way to hang Wu Sun and the cannon on Yin Yun without preventing her from flying. And looking at the backpack he had in his hands, a brilliant idea occurred to him. To use his vines as the straps of the backpack to turn the cannon into a strange backpack that would be stable and wouldn't restrain Yin Yun's movements in flight. All that remained was to figure out what to do with all the equipment and weapons that were being sculpted in the clearing right now. They could be very useful in the future, because the more equipment you have, the more protection and preparedness for the most unpredictable situations. But everything in the backpack would not fit. Wu Sun ordered Yin Yun to bring all the items that were left behind by the bad guys so he could take everything with him on the journey. She was a little shocked at how he was going to take it all with him, but she obeyed anyway. There were a lot of items, just too many. However, this did not bother our flower, for he was as greedy as he was ugly. That day, Wu Sun was clearly on a roll, and he had brilliant ideas one after another, so he quickly thought of a way to take everything with him. He decided to simply attach all this stuff to his cannon with straps. Now he began to explain to Yin Yun how to do everything right and attach all the equipment he needed to the cannon, and the good girl was happy to help Daddy. Now our little flower was no longer unarmed, and his heavily armed shadow towered over the clearing. There was room for everything, even a long sword. And the crossbow and arrows too. Now Wu Sun felt that with all this equipment he had become a heavily armed flower with a big mouth, and now all enemies should tremble at the sight of him. Now that Wu Sun was growing in the pot, these sensations transported him back in time. He felt like a monster from the game for some reason. Suddenly his musings were interrupted by the sound of rumbling that came from Yin Yun's stomach. In all this time, neither of them had eaten, so it was no surprise that the little dragoness was very hungry. Smiling awkwardly, she asked if the gecko and Wu Sun were hungry, then added that she was going to go hunting. This was just in time, since they had just experienced a big battle, and they all needed to recover their strength. But Wu Sun also warned Yin Yun about the possible danger, as they didn't know for sure if the bandits still had accomplices. Even though Yin Yun was a majestic dragon, she still obediently listened to her father's instructions. Therefore, she replied that she wouldn't act carelessly. Looking after his daughter as she flew away, our hero said to himself that he should try to work even harder on himself. This battle perfectly showed that he was still very weak. He must continue to open chests and accumulate evolution points. As the experience of the last battle showed, the grapes played a key role and literally turned the course of the battle. The same was true for the healing sweet potato roots. In addition, 4 of its vines were used to weave a backpack, and only by growing a 5th vine could he deal with unforeseen troubles. In addition, although the space in his new pot was tight, he definitely needed to save a few root potatoes. They had a long journey ahead of them, and since they didn't know what they would be facing, they needed to prepare thoroughly. This situation reminded him a lot of his mom packing his backpack for a trip. Back then, he had thought she had worried too much, but now he understood why she did it. Besides, he was a father now, and that meant responsibility. He couldn't afford to mess up. Suddenly his musings were interrupted by the corpse of a hyena falling to the ground. Yin Yun had already returned from the hunt, which meant it was time for a delicious lunch. After a while, the whole family gathered around the makeshift table to regain their strength. For the first time today, they were finally able to eat in peace and chat happily. While everyone was eating, Ruhua was sunning himself on the chest as usual. Once everyone had eaten, Wu Sun said to give him the remaining pieces of meat. He was going to use them to replenish his supply of nutritious things in the roots. After receiving the pieces of meat, our hero began to do what he had planned, namely to absorb the nutrients from the meat and direct them to himself in the root. After a moment, however, he regretted his greed. After all, his pot was quite tight, which made his large roots very cramped. The sensation was not pleasant. It was as if he was wearing swimming trunks that were several sizes smaller than necessary. Our hero's only salvation was the chests, from which he could get something that would ease his suffering. This time, he wasn't even going to draw lots, and in a hurry, he shouted to Ruhua to open them all one by one. Today, Wu Sun was really unlucky as only evolution points dropped out of all the chests. Being in a bad mood, he immediately attacked the system spirit with complaints. Ruhua, instead of excuses, began to calm him down, saying that not all was lost, because there was still the last chest. As usual, the chest glowed with a bright golden light, while the system had already sent a message of congratulations. It was because the gene of a B-level plant called baobab had dropped out of the chest. Shocked by this pleasant surprise, Wu Sun began to read the information about the gene. First of all, both stems and roots could be modified. This gene made the trunk thicker and consisted of a special wood that was perfect for storing water. This gene was especially effective during the rainy season, as it allowed it to absorb water and use it during droughts. Our hero was already familiar with this tree, for the gecko had walked on water to one just like it. It was a very useful gene to him, but he was curious as to why it had as many as 2 fusion sites. The answer to that question was quite simple. It was all for aesthetic appearance and beauty. It wouldn't be very pretty if our hero had a very thick trunk, which is why the system provided such a choice. After imagining this picture in his mind, Wu Sun couldn't help but agree with the system spirit's words. In the end, he decided to merge the gene with the roots as they didn't affect his appearance at all. After a few moments, Ruhua began the fusion. Everything was successful, and our hero managed to get the gene he needed. However, although he had gotten it, he didn't know how to use it yet. Fortunately, he had a system spirit, who kindly explained that in order to store water, it first had to get somewhere. It wasn't raining, and there were no other ways available to our hero to get the right amount of water. So the only solution was to ask Yin Yun to bring it. Fortunately, the hunters had a few water wineskins. Taking them, the dragoness immediately went to fetch water. As soon as she returned, Wu Sun immediately started testing his new gene. He couldn't wait to learn his new abilities. Even though he couldn't see what was happening underground, he could still feel the new root forming. Except that unlike the others, it held water. With the new root, however, the cramped feeling that he was getting a little used to returned. Unfortunately, there was nothing he could do about it, and all he had left to do was get used to it. Since they had already had time to rest and prepare, it was about time to set off on their journey. Yin Yun and the gecko were very excited about this, as they were already eager to see something new. After waiting for 2 more days and making sure that there were no more people around, Wu Sun decided that it was definitely time to leave. The pot our hero was growing in was taken out of the ground for the first time in a while. Once on his daughter's back, he used his vines as backpack straps. As soon as he was securely fastened, he asked Yin Yun if they were interfering with her movements. Fortunately, it was fine. Gecko was also flying along with them, so he also climbed into the muzzle of the cannon. To prevent it from accidentally falling down, Wu Sun was going to hold it down with his vine. After 2 days of actively feeding, our hero managed to grow a 5th vine after all. It was very timely, because now he didn't have to worry that all the vines would be busy. Now that everyone had taken their places and were ready to go, it was left to decide where they would go. After some thought, our hero remembered that the poachers had come from the southwest. They wouldn't want to meet such people, so it was decided to go to the east. Unfortunately, there was no map among the items the poachers had in their possession. Therefore, Wu Sun only had to rely on his wits and intuition. Yin Yun asked her father why he decided to go to the east. To this, our hero proudly replied that it was because he himself had once lived in a large country in the east, which had its roots in the New Age. Unfortunately, this information caused his daughter to have more questions than answers. Therefore, Wu Sun said that she didn't need to worry about it and should just listen to him. In time, she would figure it out on her own. Right in the next moment, they had already soared into the air. From that point on, their adventures began. The adventure they had been looking forward to so eagerly. While in the air, at a great height above the ground, Wu Sun looked around with interest. Unlike Yin Yun, who saw these views every day, this was a first time for him, and it was very exciting. Even in his previous life, he had never traveled on an airplane before. But he would never have thought that after being reborn, he would be traveling on top of a majestic creature like a dragon. As it turned out, all this time they had been living in a small oasis, around which stretched vast desert lands. The sensation of flying was indeed pleasant. But as it turned out, not everyone thought so. Things were much worse for Gecko. Whether because of the high altitude or because he was seasick, he didn't look good at all. While our hero was trying to bring the poor fellow to his senses, Yin Yun's keen eye noticed some movement down below. As soon as she realized what it was, the dragoness could no longer remain calm. She immediately cried out in panic, "Daddy, there are people down there, lots of people." In front of them was a caravan of camel-like animals and a group of people. Wu Sun managed to count about a dozen people. They had only had negative experiences with humans before, so he was immediately wary. He didn't know their intentions or what to expect from them, so he immediately ordered Yin Yun to fly as high as possible. They had to be out of the reach of their weapons. Seeing her father's concern, the dragoness asked about whether these were people from the same group of bad guys they had fought before. Wu Sun didn't think that was the case. After all, unlike those guys, this caravan was heading east just like them. In addition, he noted the presence of camels, which meant that it was not a long journey through the desert. At the same time, one of the men in the group noticed some movement in the sky. It was a dragon. He immediately reported it to their leader. He also noted that the dragon seemed to have detected them and had risen higher. This could only mean one thing: it didn't want to get into a fight and decided to stay away. Looking at the majestic creature flying in the sky, he replied that it was not surprising, because there were quite a lot of people in their group. However, there was something that surprised the leader very much. On the dragon, he noticed the barrel of a cannon, in which sat some strange flower. He had heard a lot of stories in his life, but this was the first time he had seen something so strange. The guy who first noticed the dragon asked him enthusiastically if he wanted to shoot it. After all, they could surely get a lot of money for such a rare dragon. But to the guy's disappointment, the leader didn't agree. Their mission this time was not to hunt. Besides, this time he didn't bring his dragon hunting equipment with him, and somehow he wouldn't be able to hit it from such a long distance otherwise. Hearing the answer, there was nothing left for the guy but to sigh heavily and accept it. At the same time, our heroes flew past the caravan and approached some ruins. They had already been flying for over an hour, so Wu Sun suggested finding a place to rest. Yin Yun wasn't too tired and was ready to keep flying. But our hero didn't want his daughter to overexert herself. She had only recently learned to fly, and carrying a heavy metal cannon was not an easy task. Besides, they had a long way to go, and it was best to save their strength for last. After looking around, Wu Sun decided that the best place to rest at the moment was the ruins. As soon as they descended and stepped on solid ground, our hero asked Yin Yun to find some rocks to prop up the cannon barrel. In just a few moments everything was ready and our hero could now sit confidently in his pot. At last they could rest after such a long flight. Gecko, who was afraid of heights, was particularly excited about this. Yin Yun, on the other hand, was not going to waste any time and announced that she was going to go hunting. While they were flying, she managed to spot many animals in the area. They could use some food, but Wu Sun was primarily concerned about her daughter's condition, so he suggested her to take her time and rest a little longer. In the next instant, a squeak was heard nearby. After that, the head of an animal appeared from around the corner. It was just what they needed. Even though the animal was small, they didn't even have to go anywhere. Wu Sun immediately told the others to be quiet so as not to scare it away. However, it didn't seem to notice them at all, and continued to run around carelessly looking for something. Suddenly, Wu Sun had an idea why he was behaving like this. There was very little water in the desert, so in order to survive, the animals had to rely on their senses to find it. And since there was a large supply of water in our hero's roots at the moment, the beast sensed this and came. He didn't much like being treated like a water bottle. In addition, the rodent was so bold that it headed straight for the hole in the cannon. Wu Sun had no intention of letting this happen, so he immediately used his spiked vines. After catching the insolent beast, he immediately cut off its life. Since Yin Yun had been flying all this time and must have expended a lot of energy, our hero decided to give the prey to her. But the dragoness refused, saying that the meat would not be enough for her anyway. Besides, she was going to catch something big later. In the end, the rodent went to Gecko, but as it turned out, the beast was not alone. Soon, several more rodents came running to the smell of water. Wu Sun couldn't help but be excited as the food was coming to them. In the next moment, a whole group of rodents appeared and quickly approached them. At that moment, our heroes realized that in fact everything was not as they thought. After all, it looked like the animals were in a hurry to get away from someone. Our hero immediately came to the conclusion that most likely behind the ruins really was someone. And so it was. In front of them appeared a large wolf with a rodent in its mouth. Although the wolf seemed shabby and looked more like the living dead, its intentions were clearly not good. Wu Sun immediately realized that there was clearly something wrong with the wolf. There was madness and fearlessness in its eyes, which was not exactly characteristic of wild animals. However, he also decided not to rule out the fact that this world was full of all sorts of strange creatures that he had never seen before. The wolf did not hesitate and immediately rushed at our heroes. His attack was very direct and thoughtless. However, even so, the madness and sharp fangs and claws scared Yin Yun a bit. But as it turned out, she was simply disgusted to be around such an ugly and disgusting creature. Closing her eyes, she reluctantly brushed it away. But as it turned out, that blow was enough to make it fly away. She was a dragon after all. Even so, the wolf didn't run away. From behind a dissipating cloud of dust, his silhouette appeared. He was alive and unharmed. Moreover, from its vicious growl, it was clear that it was not planning to give up. Wu Sun was finally convinced that there was something wrong with the wolf. After all, it was obvious that Yin Yun had clawed it with her claws, but it wasn't bleeding. He had no time to think and understand the situation because the wolf attacked them again. He did not take our hero for an opponent at all, and so he attacked our dragoness again. However, he had underestimated Wu Sun for nothing. In fact, while he was distracted by Yin Yun, our hero stabbed him on the back with his sword. He couldn't tolerate being treated like that, especially by someone who had decided to attack his little girl. But even after the sword strike, the wolf was still on his feet. Our heroes were puzzled and confused. They could not understand why the wolf did not die. Our hero immediately had an assumption that he could be a zombie, because all the facts pointed to it. But now it was not so important. First of all, they had to deal with the enemy, which continued fearlessly attack. This all in the end finally bored our hero, and so he decided not to hold back and end it all. He was an expert at killing zombies in games, so he was confident in his abilities. With a furious swing of his sword, he cut off the wolf's head, leaving him no chance. Falling off, the head rolled on the ground. But even without a body, it continued to move. This was truly something abnormal. Even though the wolf couldn't do anything else, Wu Sun still thrust his sword into its head to end its suffering. Luckily it worked and the wolf fell silent. As soon as it was over, Yin Yun rushed to her father with questions. She didn't understand what kind of monster it was, or why it was still alive after its head was cut off. Our hero didn't really know what it was. This information they had yet to find out. However, our hero was sure of one thing. If he knew what the enemy's abilities were beforehand, he would have been dead long ago. He still really didn't know much about this world, so he didn't need to be surprised by such small things. Their company already consisted of a strange talking plant, an intelligent gecko, and a legendary dragon. Therefore, some zombie wolf didn't look so strange against them anymore. Since there were still a lot of strange things and creatures ahead of them, they had to get used to it. However, our hero was still interested in the origin of the zombie wolf. In his homeworld, they were only a fiction. However, even in the stories, their appearing was explained by a virus or an infection that was caused by a talisman or even Taoism. Taking a closer look at the wolf, our hero immediately discarded the idea of a virus because there were no bite marks on the wolf. In addition, his body was devoid of water like the mummies made by the ancient Egyptians, which suggested that he could be man-made. Which raised the question of who could make walking zombies. Since this world was full of mysteries, it could not be ruled out that mysticism and magic could be used here. Therefore, some priest, wizard, or necromancer might do it. While Wu Sun was pondering this, the gecko pointed at the wolf's head and asked if they could eat this. Strangely enough, he was not at all embarrassed by what was happening. Fortunately, our hero was not that desperate, and immediately said that there was no way they could eat it. There was a good chance they might become like them. And besides, they'd probably break their teeth eating such old meat. Since it was dangerous to even stay close to the body, it was decided to move away. Besides, it was finally time for them to rest and hit the road, and they hadn't even caught anything to eat yet. In the following footage, we see the ostrich in its natural habitat. These creatures are known for their great speed. Oh, isn't that an animal show? Excuse me, back to our story. The poor ostrich with an arrow in its softest part was for some reason desperate to get away from someone. As expected, it was our heroes who decided to play a hunting simulator. Well, to tell the truth, they were just trying to get food. So far, it hasn't worked out so well, because the first arrow didn't do much damage. Realizing that it would be very difficult for him to hit at this distance, Wu Sun asked his daughter to fly closer. Listening to her daddy, Yin Yun immediately flew up close enough to hit the target for sure. In the next second, the arrow was already heading towards its target at a tremendous speed. It was a headshot, instant death. The bird only had time to open its mouth, while its cry never had time to escape. The skills from the games were really paying off. With a loud noise, the ostrich's body fell to the ground. It was really quite an easy and successful hunt. Everyone immediately started praising our hero for his accurate shot. They still hadn't been able to rest and eat properly before, but now they would finally be able to do so. As soon as they lowered to the ground, Wu Sun immediately started giving out orders on what needed to be done. Since they were planning to rest and eat a bit in the area, he told the gecko to bury it in the ground. Since they had the right tools with them, it didn't take much time to dig the hole. Sitting in his pot, our hero grudgingly noticed that along the way he had found many ruins that had once been someone's home. The large number of them alarmed him, because they were not just single houses, but entire villages. But he had no desire to think about that now. All he wanted to do now was to eat and rest. The others were also all for it, and in a moment they were all eating ostrich meat. While the family was enjoying the delicious ostrich meat, Ruhua was sitting on the chests watching them. Since he was only a system spirit, he was also traveling along with them. While stuffing another piece of meat into his mouth, Yin Yun suddenly asked Wu Sun if he liked the meat. Our hero replied that yes, because unlike the wolf meat, it was much juicier and softer. Since we're on the subject of wolves, here they are. Suddenly, someone's head appeared from behind the wall. Judging by the aura emitted by its owner, his intentions were not good. However, our heroes noticed the danger quite late. The danger was really quite big, as a pack of desert wolves appeared in front of them in the blink of an eye. Wu Sun wasn't really afraid of them. He was more disappointed that he had made such a mistake. He had completely forgotten that such a feast would definitely attract predators. But there was nothing to do. He had to fight. He didn't want to run away, besides it was a chance to get a lot of meat. He immediately ordered the gecko to climb into his pot, while he told Yin Yun to get ready and cover him from above. Taking out all of his available weapons, our hero prepared for battle. He was now fully confident in his strength, as he was no longer the weak flower he used to be. Unfortunately for the wolves, they didn't know that. So with a loud howl, they rushed towards our heroes. 3 wolves at once with a great speed began to approach, hoping to get the meat they smelled. Unfortunately for them, there was no meat. All that was there was an arrow, which Wu Sun immediately fired at the first wolf that appeared. The arrow hit the target, causing the victim's heart to stop beating in an instant. However, the death of their comrade had no effect on the others. They continued to run, hoping to get rid of the offenders. Our hero was also ready to fight. In addition to arrows, he also had swords, which he did not mind swinging. At one point, he even found himself surrounded by several wolves. However, he had nothing to worry about because he still had his daughter, who, although still inexperienced, was already a legendary dragon. After catching the inattentive wolf, she quickly lifted him into the air. Everything seemed to be going well at first, but that was only at first. At some point, another wolf appeared from behind the cliff and was about to stealthily attack our hero from behind. Yin Yun was the first who noticed it, and immediately informed Wu Sun about the danger. At the last moment, Wu Sun realized that the situation was bad. He couldn't do anything in time. He realized that it was his fault for being too careless. Time seemed to slow down, and the question arose in his mind. Is this the end? Luckily for our hero, that wasn't the case. Either out of panic or she had planned it that way, Yin Yun threw the wolf down. And when it landed, it fell right on top of the wolf, which almost caught up with our hero. In any case, it was a very accurate hit. Wu Sun immediately praised his daughter, because she had just literally saved his life. But there was no time to rejoice in their victory, because the wolves were still alive, and that meant the battle was on. Our hero immediately struck where the wolves stay. However, they were not so easy, and were able to come to their senses and dodge his attack. The wolves did not plan to give up, but our heroes did not plan to run away. As practice had already shown, their duo was very effective and coordinated. But the wolves also had a trump card up their sleeve. Their leader raised his head and let out a long howl. Their advantage wasn't strength or anything else. Their trump card was quantity because they were a pack. In addition, wolves were very famous for their teamwork. Yin Yun was a little intimidated by such a large number, while Wu Sun still planned to give battle. At that moment, his eyes were burning like never before, and he was ready to use all his abilities to win. But suddenly something alerted the wolf leader. An unforeseen situation in the middle of a battle wasn't good sign. While the others continued to hold the line and watch the actions of our heroes, the leader and another wolf stood in the rear defense, where the danger was coming from. This was a very unexpected turn of events. Even though Wu Sun didn't see what was happening there, it wasn't hard to guess that the wolves were attacked from behind. But the biggest question was what kind of creature dared to provoke a pack of wolves. After a moment, everything became clear. The pack had been attacked by other desert wolves, and immediately the slaughter began. But it wasn't that simple, because these were no ordinary wolves at all. They were zombie wolves. Our hero was shocked by what was happening. He thought that the zombie wolf was a rare case, and they were just unlucky to meet him. But as it turned out, it was very common. Zombies weren't just wolves, though. Soon a few more creatures appeared on the horizon. As it turned out, the foxes were also infected. Even Wu Sun was frightened, as something really abnormal was happening in the wilderness. At one point, it even seemed to him that the zombie apocalypse had arrived. But even that didn't end the surprises. Not far away from them, a clawed hand appeared from behind a wall of ruins. And no, it didn't belong to an animal. It was a zombie man, who resembled a zombie from the game Plants vs. Zombies. Standing up to his full height, he immediately let out a fierce roar. But his introduction did not last long, because in the next moment he rushed at the first uninfected wolf. The appearance of the zombie man was a great surprise to Wu Sun. He had hoped until the last moment that he wouldn't see them. However, he now began to understand why there were so many ruins in the desert. After all, it looks like it was because of the virus that all the people could turn into dead people. While our hero was pondering this, the zombie man kept biting harder and harder into the poor wolf's body. And just like that, in an instant, the hunter turned into prey. In his past life, Wu Sun had seen quite a lot of zombie movies. In them, the infection was transmitted in different ways, and one of them was infection through blood. So watching all of these, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen to the wolf, and whether it would turn into a zombie. After finishing with the wolf, the zombie stopped. As if it had lost all interest in him, it began to rise to its feet. However, he did not stand still for long. In the next moment, it rushed towards the other uninfected wolves. They were frightened and shocked, because they couldn't understand at what moment they had become someone's prey. At the same time, the wolf that had just been killed by the zombie rose to his feet. He was now a zombie as well. He no longer had the ability to think straight. He had only one desire: to kill. Now he no longer paid attention to the fact that he was attacking his kin, and that he was mercilessly biting into their throats. The uninfected wolves were confused and did not understand why their comrades suddenly began to attack them. Our heroes watched it all with horror on their faces. They had no desire to interfere. Our hero had a hard time believing that what he had once seen in movies and games was happening right before his eyes. However, they couldn't be only spectators. After all, the zombie did not stop at the wolves and began to approach them. There was nothing else they could do, so they were going to fight. Taking out his blade, Wu Sun began to swing it furiously in an attempt to finish off the zombie. He was used to the zombies in games and movies being dumb, and dealing with them one at a time was not a problem. However, things were different here. The zombie man was quite agile and dodged his blow. Seeing this, our hero realized that everything would not be as easy as he imagined. However, he did not plan to give up. With even greater fury, he began to strike the zombie, which came closer and closer. But as it turned out, it was no use at all. In an instant, the zombie was right in front of him. Wu Sun knew what the problem was. His opponent had very rough skin and hard flesh. He wasn't afraid of chopping blows at all. In addition, he didn't feel any pain at all, which allowed him to calmly charge forward. In this situation, there were only two options: either chop off his head or chop off his legs, thus immobilizing him. And so, the moment had arrived. Wu Sun and the zombies clashed in a deadly battle where their lives were at stake. It was hard to tell who would win, but one thing was certain: only one could survive. And so the zombie opened his mouth with a fierce roar, rushed at our hero. However, he failed to reach his goal because he missed and crashed into the barrel of the cannon. Unfortunately, his rotten teeth did not allow him to bite through the metal, so the replenishment of metal in the zombie body had to be delayed. But as it turned out, the zombie wasn't the only one who screwed up. Wu Sun had also missed. As a result, the two losers were frozen in a battle of glances. Yet it didn't last long. In the next instant, the frightened scream of our hero was heard, as well as the furious roar of the zombies. The reason for Wu Sun's frightened cry was quite simple. There was no way he wanted to become a zombie flower with a big mouth. Because of his self-confidence, Wu Sun had greatly underestimated his opponent, and he immediately paid for it. After reaching him, the zombie clutched at his leaves. Fortunately, it was only leaves and nothing more. In the end, our hero was hardly even hurt. However, he had now confirmed his theory. Zombies were indeed very fragile and needed moisture. This was the reason for the attack on him specifically. It seemed that the zombie's plans had been revealed. Since the zombie only managed to eat a little bit of leaves, it let out a furious and dissatisfied roar. But the fact that Wu Sun was able to understand the reason for the zombie's attack didn't change anything. After all, he was still in a desperate situation, one-on-one with the zombie. In addition, this time the zombie did not touch his leaves, but immediately clawed at his head. Our hero was once again very careless. To his horror, he began to feel the one gradually absorbing his moisture. Wu Sun began to panic, so he could not cope with it on his own. Luckily, he had a dragon daughter who immediately rushed to his aid. Grabbing the zombie, she started trying to pull him away from her daddy. However, the zombie clung to our hero so tightly that he didn't let go even when they started to rise into the air. All the while, Wu Sun continued to scream desperately. It was the first time in a long time that he felt so horrible and helpless. The moisture was continuously being sucked out of him, and on top of that, his stem was threatening to burst at any moment under such a heavy load. Heroes do appear at the last and most important moment. This time that hero was a gecko, which everyone had already forgotten about. Even despite his fear of heights, he fearlessly grabbed an arrow and stuck it in the zombie's eye. As it turned out, it was quite effective. Once the zombie relaxed its grip a bit, Wu Sun decided to take this chance. He instantly drew his sword with the intention of finishing off the zombie. The sword was more effective than the arrow, and did much more damage. As a result, the zombie let our poor hero go. Luckily, this blow was enough to finish off the walking dead. He fell to the ground with a clatter, and the fire in his eyes faded. It seemed to our heroes that it was all over. They began to ask each other how they were feeling. Wu Sun had indeed suffered the most in this fight. He felt as if he had been squeezed dry. Flying over to them, Yin Yun also inquired about her daddy's well-being. However, even one look at him was enough to realize that he was clearly not all right. Fortunately, it wasn't really that bad. He had admitted it himself. After all, he just had some water sucked out of him and a leaf torn off. These injuries were far from fatal. Wu Sun had a couple of useful abilities that allowed him to recover in a matter of seconds. Just a moment later, our hero was fully recovered. He was truly pleased with how useful his skills were. Yin Yun also praised his miraculous roots, the effect of which was even better than her dragon regeneration. But their conversation was interrupted by a noise. As it turned out, the battle between the zombies and the wolves was far from over. From the beginning, the wolves had somehow managed to cope with the waves of zombies, and had even managed to maintain almost all of their numbers. However, things got really bad when a zombie bit their leader. Though his pack members tried to help him, they weren't very good at it. The zombie continued to suck the life out of the wolf. It seemed like this was the end for the pack. Wu Sun himself understood the consequences. If the leader turned into a zombie, the rest of the pack members would most likely turn into zombies as well. Besides, if he was leading an organized group of zombie wolves, it would be much harder to fight them. Having come to these conclusions, our hero decided to help the wolves. After all, as they say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Wu Sun also decided to choose between the two evils, who would be easier to fight in the future. In the next instant, the arrow was already heading towards its target at a great speed. Our hero was quite a good archer, so he was able to hit the zombie in the head without any problems. But as it turned out, it was not enough to kill it. From a great distance, the arrow could not get to the brain. Fortunately, as it turned out, it didn't matter. The arrow was able to distract the zombie and make it let go of the wolf leader, and that was enough for him to come to his senses and break free. The wolf did not plan to stop at the release, and so immediately jumped on the zombie from the back. It was a very good and effective solution. Thanks to this, the arrow pierced through the zombie's head, thus ending its suffering forever. For some more time, the leader held the zombie tightly. He already had experience with the living dead, which made him want to make sure it was dead for sure. Even after some time, the zombie did not give any sign of life. This meant only one thing, their victory. Standing on the defeated enemy, Akela let out a victorious howl. Our heroes were also happy about this small victory. Wu Sun was delighted by the sharp mind of the pack leader. At first glance, one would think that he had knocked down the zombie and driven an arrow into its head by accident. But our hero knew that this was not the case. Although the wolf was quite smart, but he still did not have enough brains not to mess with the company of our hero. At the command of their leader, the wolves surrounded them, and the vicious growl of their leader made it clear that they were determined to fight. This ungrateful behavior of the wolves made Wu Sun very angry. He would have preferred to disperse peacefully, but the wolves didn't support this idea. They had chosen this path, so it was up to our hero to show them how wrong it was for them. However, to the surprise of our heroes, the wolves did not attack. It looked as if their leader had common sense. Turning around, he led his pack away. Looking at them, Wu soon noted that they really had a conscience, or they didn't risk it since they had already seen their power. Besides, their numbers had been greatly reduced after the clash with the zombies. However, no matter how it was, our heroes remained after all this only in the advantage. After all, now they didn't need to worry about food. Although they could not eat zombie wolves, but without them, they would have something to eat. After all, our hero had managed to kill several normal wolves with his blade and crossbow. Since everyone was very hungry after such a tense incident, Wu Sun didn't hesitate. He told Yin Yun to retrieve the arrows from the corpses so that he could use them next time. He himself was going to collect and cook the corpses of normal wolves. Everyone completed their tasks rather quickly, and after a while they were ready to enjoy their meal. Another danger was behind them, and now they could rest and relax. After a while, everyone had eaten to their heart's content. Even Wu Sun, who could hold a lot thanks to the roots, refused to continue eating. After eating so densely, they still had a few corpses left. Since they could no longer hold much more now, Yin Yun offered to take them with them on the road. However, this was not the best idea. The temperature in the desert was very high, and so the meat here would spoil very quickly, and they would become infested with parasites. Suddenly, the ingenious Wu Sun had an idea. After all, if there was spoiled meat nearby, there would be flies they could eat. But in the next moment, he discarded the idea. He didn't even want to think about eating flies now. He was no longer the primitive plant that couldn't afford to choose what to eat. Unfortunately, his roots were already completely full. Though it was a big waste, there was nothing they could do about it. But there were some good points in this whole sad and wasteful story. Thanks to the large amount of meat eaten, our hero was able to get a lot of chests. And since there was no point in putting it off, he immediately told Ruhua to open them. Unfortunately, the loot from the chests did not please him once again. Only evolution points dropped from all the chests. This couldn't help but be disappointing, so Wu Sun immediately voiced his complaints to the system spirit. Ruhua nonchalantly replied that it wasn't his fault. The reason was because of the barren terrain, which made the chance of a gene dropping out very small. This was the first time Wu Sun had heard of this, so he decided to memorize this information. However, Ruhua still had something else to say to our hero. He said that even if he managed to obtain the gene, he would hardly be able to develop it. His roots were already struggling to fit into the canon, and if he obtained any similar gene, it would be a problem. Wu Sun couldn't help but agree with the system spirit's reasoning. He himself realized that his pot was limiting him a lot. His only solution was to find a fertile piece of land and settle there. Only then would he be able to fully develop and evolve. Determined to find a place for his new home, our heroes decided to continue their sometimes dangerous but exciting journey. After a few days of traveling over the desert, Wu Sun began to doubt that it was really exciting. No matter how long they flew, the sand and ruins never ended. He now understood more why people traveled exclusively on camels. Traveling under the grueling heat was really quite exhausting. Even the breeze that blew around them was very hot and didn't help at all. Wu Sun immediately felt nostalgic for the air conditioning. Unfortunately, these were only unattainable fantasies. The only thing they could do now to escape the unbearable heat was to take a break in the ruins. At night, when the temperature would be much lower, they would continue their journey. Although Yin Yun was also feeling very bad, but she replied that they were running out of water, and they urgently needed to find a water source. Wu Sun understood this himself. However, he was more worried that if she overworked herself, there was no way they would be able to fly to this place. After finding a suitable ruin where they could hide from the heat, they decided to take a break there. As soon as they landed on the ground, our hero immediately began to look around. Along the way, they constantly encountered ruins that resembled once existing villages and towns. So he had a question about who built them and why they were destroyed. But he was unable to find an answer to this question when suddenly something caught Yin Yun's attention. In the next instant, she panicked and shouted that there were zombie peoples. As soon as Wu Sun heard the word zombie, he immediately drew his sword. He couldn't relax even for a second, so he immediately asked his daughter where they were. But as it turned out, the alarm was false. In front of them was just a dried-up corpse of a man. It looked very much like he had committed suicide. It might have seemed like a coincidence, since people often did that. However, that wasn't the only thing that was strange. This person, when he was alive, did not dress like someone who had lived in the desert for a long time. Strange things really did happen here once upon a time. To gather even more clues and understand what happened here, Wu Sun asked Yin Yun to guide him through the ruins. While exploring the ruins, they were able to come across quite a few dried corpses. The strangest thing was that there were no zombie bite marks on them, which meant that they had died in some other way. Like the first corpse, some also committed suicide. Now our hero could say with certainty that this was no coincidence, and his first thought was that maybe they didn't want to become zombies. Remembering the strange zombies they had encountered earlier, he also speculated that these corpses might have had something to do with it. However, he wasn't allowed to ponder this any further. A stream of water immediately poured down on his head. As it turned out, it was Yin Yun. Holding a wineskin in her hands, she was trying to water him. Wu Sun immediately shouted in panic for her to stop. The dragoness immediately asked in bewilderment why. Our hero began to explain that the water in the bucket was now very hot, and it couldn't be used immediately. After all, even if the temperature of the water was not very hot, it was risky for him to water himself immediately after being in the sun. Besides, he didn't need the water yet, for he had a supply that he kept in his roots. Meanwhile, she really needed it. Yin Yun was not only big, but also needed a lot of water after a long flight under the grueling sun. Yin Yun agreed with his words, but the problem was that the supply they had left was only enough for one day. But even so, Wu Sun had a solution. Since he had gained so many evolution points, he could now easily grow grapes for them. With it, they would be able to get both nutrients and water. Although our hero said this to his daughter to reassure her, the truth was that things were really not very rosy. Even though he had quite a few points, they wouldn't last long. In addition, the water in the wineskin was indeed almost running out. Wu Sun realized that he had been too optimistic, and had hoped that he had been able to do everything. However, in reality, it turned out that they could die simply from lack of water. The only way to solve this was to find a source of water in the next 3 days. Soon the sun disappeared over the horizon and night fell. As the temperature dropped quite low, our heroes continued on their way. Soon, Yin Yun exclaimed in an excited voice that an oasis could be seen ahead. Although this was great news, Wu Sun was quite skeptical. He didn't rule out the fact that it could be just a mirage. However, to find out, he had to go down and check it out. At the same time, there was a dead camel lying on the ground in the middle of the oasis. As it turned out, it had not died a natural death. It had been killed by a large unknown black creature for which it was just lunch. At some point, the creature sensed something and looked up. It couldn't help but notice Yin Yun flying by. The mysterious creature was a black dragon. It was very interested in what it saw. It grinned and said that it had finally met the perfect prey.